They called it the Channel Dash. But that name is almost too casual for what actually happened. Three of Nazi Germany's most powerful warships, the battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, sailed directly through the English Channel in broad daylight, past the home coastline of the most experienced naval nation on Earth, with the cliffs of Dover close enough that shore batteries tried and failed to hit them, and Britain, the nation that had commanded the seas for 3 centuries, watched it happen and could not stop it. Before we go any further, I want you to understand something that most retellings skip over. This was not a surprise attack on an unsuspecting enemy. British intelligence, through the Ultra program at Bletchley Park, had intercepted German signals pointing clearly toward a channel transit. The Royal Navy had a contingency plan. They had radar, they had submarines, destroyers, torpedo bombers, and coastal artillery. And every single layer of that defense, the submarines, the radar pickets, the air patrols, the torpedo aircraft, failed. Not because the Germans were superhuman, but because the British could not coordinate, could not communicate, and could not bring themselves to believe that anyone would actually do something so audacious. That is what makes this story worth 3 or 4 hours of your time. The Channel Dash of the 11th, 12th, and 13th of February, 1942, is one of the most studied episodes of the Second World War precisely because it defies simple explanation. It is not a story of one hero or one villain. It is a story of systems, and what happens when one side's system functions with near mechanical precision while the other side's collapses under the weight of its own assumptions. There are 18 chapters ahead of us. We will start in the port of Brest in 1941, before any of this was inevitable, and we will end in the German home ports in the grey, early hours of February the 13th, 1942. Along the way, we are going to meet the officers and sailors who sailed that night, the fighter pilots who flew cover in fog and sleet, the young British aviators who flew biplanes into cannon fire and did not come back, and the admirals on both sides who made decisions they would spend the rest of their lives either defending or regretting. Make yourself comfortable. This is going to take a while, and it should, because the Channel Dash deserves to be understood, not just as a naval embarrassment or a German propaganda triumph, but as a precise human story of how history pivots on the moments when courage and competence, or the lack of them, exist on opposite sides. Chapter 1. The ships at Brest Long. Before the night in question, there was a port. Brest sits at the very westernmost tip of occupied France, a natural deep-water harbour that the Kriegsmarine had seized along with the rest of northern France in the summer of 1940. For a navy trying to wage an Atlantic war from a traditionally North Sea power base, Brest was a gift. It put German surface vessels within striking range of the Atlantic convoy lanes, the arteries that kept Britain fed and armed. And from the spring of 1941 onward, it was home to 3 ships that the Royal Navy considered among the most dangerous on the ocean. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, the twin sisters, as they were sometimes called by those who admired them, were not, technically speaking, battleships, though the Germans preferred to call them that. The British naval lexicon classified them as battle cruisers, powerful, fast, and relatively well-armoured vessels built for sustained ocean raiding rather than line-of-battle slugging matches. Each displaced 38,700 tons when fully loaded. Each could run at 31 knots. Each carried a main battery of 9 11-inch guns in 3 turrets, backed by 12 5.9-inch secondary pieces. They had been laid down in the early years of Nazi rearmament, launched in 1936, and were the first major capital ships of what radar had once dreamed would become a genuinely world-class fleet. Their authorized complement ran to 1,669 men each, 56 officers, and over 1,600 enlisted sailors. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had arrived in Brest together in March of 1941, having just concluded a remarkably successful North Atlantic cruise. In roughly 2 months at sea, they had sunk 22 merchant ships, totaling close to 116,000 tons, a significant blow to the convoy system Britain depended upon. But both ships had taken damage. Scharnhorst in particular had developed serious boiler problems, and the decision was made to put both vessels in for extended repairs at the excellent French dockyard. The thinking was straightforward. Fix the ships, let them rest, send them out again. What nobody anticipated was that the repair stay would stretch to nearly a year. The French resistance moved quickly. Within 10 days of the ship's arrival, British Bomber Command knew exactly where they were. 109 aircraft attacked the harbour, dropping 132 tons of bombs. The ships survived undamaged, but the raids did not stop. Over the following months, the RAF returned again and again to what flight crews began calling, with dark humour, the Brest Target Flotilla. Between the 1st of August and the 31st of December 1941, British airmen dropped 1,200 tons of bombs over the 3 capital ships. Several direct hits were scored. Hundreds of men were killed or wounded. And yet, through a combination of excellent damage control, determined German engineering, and enough bad luck on the British side to fill a separate documentary, the ships endured. The most dramatic moment came early. On the 5th of April, 1941, a Bristol Beaufort torpedo bomber, flown by Flying Officer Kenneth Campbell, attacked Gneisenau while she was moored in the inner harbour, surrounded by anti-aircraft batteries and 3 flak ships. Campbell flew in at 50 feet above the water. He released his torpedo. It hit Gneisenau's stern, wrecking the starboard propeller shaft and forcing the crew to pump out the compartments to prevent sinking. Campbell then had to make a steep banking turn with no room to maneuver, and was shot down into the harbour. He and his 3 crewmen were killed. The Germans buried them with full military honours. He was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. Gneisenau spent 6 months in dry dock after Campbell's torpedo. Then on the 1st of June, 1941, Prinz Eugen limped into Brest to join them. The heavy cruiser, 697 feet long, displacing 19,050 tons, capable of over 32 knots, had just narrowly escaped the naval engagement that destroyed her consort, the battleship Bismarck. She carried 8 8-inch guns in her main battery, 6 torpedo tubes, and a company of 42 officers, and 1,340 enlisted men. She arrived in need of repairs, following a bomb hit that had killed 47 of her crew, and found herself assigned to a harbour that was rapidly becoming the most bombed real estate in German-controlled France. For the Kriegsmarine, the logic of keeping these ships at Brest was sound, on paper. Their very presence there forced the Royal Navy to maintain a substantial reaction, force in home waters, tying down ships and aircraft that were desperately needed elsewhere in a now global war. Admiral Raeder called this the fleet in being concept. You do not have to fight to have strategic effect if the enemy must always prepare to fight you. But the cost of that strategy was accumulating daily in the form of RF bombs, dead sailors, and ships that sat half-repaired in a French harbour, growing increasingly untenable, increasingly exposed, and increasingly expensive to maintain. By the autumn of 1941, the situation at Brest had become, in Rader's own private assessment, uncomfortable in ways that had nothing to do with the bombing. The Führer was watching, and the Führer, who had never truly understood naval theory and cared little for the elegant logic of the fleet in being, was growing impatient. The ships at Brest, to Hitler's mind, were not doing enough. They were sitting. They were absorbing resources. They were being bombed. And while they sat, Norway, which Hitler had declared a zone of destiny, lacked adequate naval forces to defend against the Allied invasion he had convinced himself was coming. Something, he had decided, needed to change. The only question was how. Chapter 2, Hitler's Order. The 29th of December, 1941 was not a good day for Grand Admiral Erich Raeder. He had been summoned to Hitler's underground headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, buried in the forests near Görlitz in East Prussia, for what he had every reason to expect would be an unpleasant conversation. He was not disappointed. Hitler, fresh from the shocks of the previous year's naval disasters, the loss of Bismarck in May, and more recently, the Japanese sinking of HMS Prince of Wales and repulse off Malaya in December, had arrived at a conclusion that struck Raeder with something close to physical force. Battleships, Hitler told the assembled officers with characteristic bluntness, have had their day. The argument Hitler made that afternoon was not, in isolation, entirely without logic. Bismarck had been sunk after a 100-hour sea battle, taking all but 115 of her 2,200 crew members with her. Prince of Wales and Repulse had been dispatched by Japanese torpedo aircraft operating from land bases. Capital ships, Hitler argued, were consuming immense resources: steel, fuel, trained men, and delivering diminishing strategic returns. Those resources, he insisted, would be better applied to the vast land campaign, grinding forward into Soviet Russia. It was the reasoning of a man who had grown up on the Western Front, not on the ocean, and it showed. But that did not make it politically resistible. What followed was the directive that would set the Channel Dash in motion. Hitler declared Norway a zone of destiny, a phrase that tells you something about the grandiosity of his strategic imagination, and demanded that all available Kriegsmarine capital ships be redeployed to Norwegian waters to defend against the Allied invasion he was certain was being planned. The Tirpitz was already there. Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Prinz Eugen were to join her, and they were to do so by running through the English Channel. Because Hitler, characteristically, had looked at a map and made a decision that his professional naval commanders considered either insane or suicidal, and often both. Raeder fought back, not loudly. That was not how one survived in the Third Reich, but methodically through the proper channels of professional objection. On the 8th of January, 1942, he submitted a formal memorandum outlining all alternatives to a channel transit. The route around Ireland and through the Denmark Strait offered more open water, more room to maneuver, and a better chance of evading the home fleet based at Scapa Flow. Yes, there was risk in any route. But the Channel route, Raeder wrote, in my innermost conviction, offered the certainty of heavy loss, and he stated plainly that he could not professionally recommend it. It was as close to defiance as the naval culture of the time allowed. Hitler read the memo and was unmoved. On the 12th of January, 1942, Raeder and a group of senior commanders, including Field Marshal Keitel, General Jodl, General Jeschonnek of the Luftwaffe, and a certain Colonel Adolf Galland, gathered at the Wolf's Lair for a coordination conference. Hitler was direct. He acknowledged the theoretical value of the fleet in being. He dismissed it. He likened the ships at Brest to a cancer patient who could either accept a drastic operation or die of inaction, and he pointed out, not inaccurately, that the strategic situation required decisive measures. Then he announced, with the finality that characterized his military decisions, in the confident years of 1942, I have determined to withdraw the ships from Brest. With that sentence, Operation Cerberus became real. The Luftwaffe's portion was assigned the separate code name Operation Donnerkeil, Thunderbolt. 252 fighters would be provided. Colonel Galland, one of Germany's most celebrated combat pilots, was given personal command of the air cover operation. He later admitted that the assignment came to him partly because more senior officers, convinced the operation would end in disaster, were distancing themselves from it, leaving him to either fail magnificently or succeed improbably. He had been awarded the Swords and Diamonds to his Knight's Cross by Hitler just weeks earlier. He was not a man inclined to expect failure. What followed the Wolf's Lair Conference was one of the more remarkable exercises in an operational security that the Second World War produced. Tropical uniforms were conspicuously delivered to each warship, the implication being that the ships were bound for warm waters. Invitations to a grand costume ball scheduled for the 12th of February in the city of Brest were distributed to enlisted men who would, by that date, be far out to sea in the English Channel. Non-German dockyard workers were quietly removed from the repair facilities, and Commodore Friedrich Rueg's minesweepers began clearing and marking pathways along the planned route, operating only at night, so that British reconnaissance aircraft would see nothing unusual. Two specially modified Heinkel He-111 bombers began flying along the Channel coast, carrying powerful transmitters that jammed British radar gradually so that British technicians would attribute the interference to atmospheric conditions rather than deliberate electronic attack. There was one dissenting voice at the Wolf's Lair that day that history records with particular clarity. Commodore Rouge, who commanded the minesweepers, stood up and said plainly that he had encountered new British magnetic mines that his vessels could not reliably detect or clear. He could not guarantee safe passage. It was an honest, professional assessment delivered in front of the supreme commander of the German armed forces. Hitler heard it, acknowledged it, and proceeded with the plan anyway. Rouge's warning would prove partially prophetic, but only partially. And that partial prophecy would matter enormously before the night was out. Chapter 3, Operation Fuller and its holes. The British were not blind. That is the first thing to say about Operation Fuller. The Royal Navy and RAF's contingency plan to intercept any German breakout from Brest, and it is important to say it, because the popular narrative of the Channel Dash tends to flatten the British into hapless bystanders. They were not. Through the extraordinary intelligence program at Bletchley Park, they had been reading German naval enigma traffic for months. As early as late January of 1942, ultra-intercepts indicated that Germans were sweeping the English Channel for mines, a detail that points unmistakably toward an imminent transit. In early February, further decrypts described the Channel as the most probable breakout route. So why did it not matter? The answer involves one of those historiographical arguments that naval historians have been having since 1942, and it is worth pausing on. The intelligence failure at the Channel Dash was not primarily one of collection. The information was being gathered. It was a failure of timeliness and analysis. The intercepts for the 10th through the 12th of February were not decrypted until the 15th of February, 3 days after the ships had already arrived in Germany. The operational tempo of German movements outran the analytical capacity of the people processing the intelligence. By the time the right people had the right information, the ships were already home. But there was more to it than a decryption backlog. The senior British officers who designed Operation Fuller were working from an assumption so deeply held that it had hardened into a presumption that any German breakout would happen at night. The logic seemed sound. The Germans would never risk their most valuable surface assets in daylight, within range of British coastal guns and aircraft, passing through the narrow throat of the English Channel in full visibility. Therefore, the breakout, if it came, would come at night. And because it would come at night, the German ships would be approaching the Dover Strait in darkness, which meant they had to have left Brest in daylight, which meant they would be spotted by the standing air patrols in the Bay of Biscay before they ever reached the Channel proper. The problem was that Hitler and Ciliax had made precisely the opposite calculation. A nighttime passage through the Dover Strait meant daylight entry into the North Sea, which was far more dangerous. And besides, Hitler did not think the British could react quickly enough, even if they did spot the fleet in daylight. I don't think the British capable of making and carrying out lightning decisions, he said at the Wolf's Lair, with the particular confidence of a man who had, to that point, been proved right about such things rather too often. He was, on this occasion, correct again. Operation Fuller had been designed by the Admiralty and RAF chiefs. Admiral Dudley Pound, Air Vice Marshal Jack Baldwin of Bomber Command, and Air Chief Marshal Philip Joubert of Coastal Command, through a series of careful planning, meetings. On paper, it was not a weak plan. Pound's light surface forces, destroyers and motor torpedo boats, were suited to the Channel's shallow, confined waters. 300 Bomber Command aircraft were allocated, though everybody who had ever tried to hit a moving ship with an unguided bomb from altitude knew what those numbers were worth. Fleet Air Arm had 6 Fairy Swordfish torpedo planes, reconstituting after the Bismarck campaign. Nearly 400 Hurricanes and Spitfires were available for cover. Radar stations along the south coast could theoretically detect ships all the way to the French shore. What the plan lacked was not hardware. It lacked a unified command. There was no single officer responsible for coordinating the response. No one person who could, on the morning everything went wrong, look at the full picture and direct assets toward the right place at the right moment. The RAF had its chains of command. The Royal Navy had its own. They were not integrated. They were parallel lines that were expected to somehow converge on the enemy at the critical moment. And when that moment came, they did not converge. They diverged, hesitated, and arrived piecemeal at a crisis that demanded simultaneous, overwhelming force. There was also the question of disposition, where things were, physically, when they were needed. The Bristol Beaufort torpedo bombers of Coastal Command were supposed to be the primary strike weapon against heavy ships, and they were spread across 2 squadrons, 42 Squadron at Leuchars in Scotland, and 86 Squadron at St. Evol in Cornwall. A 3rd Squadron, 217, was at Thorney Island near Portsmouth. None of these units were within easy striking distance of the Dover Strait. Moving them would take time. And in a crisis driven by surprise and speed, time was the one commodity that Operation Fuller could not manufacture. The Admiralty had been worried enough about a German breakout that it had stationed submarines off Brest. But by early February, in one of those bureaucratic decisions that makes historians groan, the submarine watch had been reduced from 7 boats, most of them old training, vessels to just 2, because The sustained patrol was drawing too heavily on the supply of new submariners. What remained was barely adequate, even if everything went perfectly. As we will see, nothing went perfectly. On the night the ship sailed, those submarines were in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. Chapter 4, The Night They Left Brest. The 11th of February, 1942, was a Tuesday. In the harbour at Brest, the day had the strange quality of a held breath. The dockyard had been sealed off. Non-German workers had been sent home. The officers and most of the men aboard Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Prinz Eugen went about their ordinary duties, unaware of what the evening held. Though the atmosphere, as one account describes it, carried a particular charge that experienced sailors would have recognized. Things were being checked twice. Things that were usually left until morning were being finished now. Men were being quiet in the particular way that men are quiet when they know something is about to happen but have been told not to discuss it. Vice Admiral Otto Ciliax had gathered his ship's captains earlier that day aboard Scharnhorst for the final briefing. Ciliax was not a man given to theatrical speeches. He was a long-serving battleship officer who had reached senior rank through steady professional competence rather than dazzling brilliance, and his approach to the operation reflected that temperament. He told his captains the facts. At 20:30 hours, the 3 capital ships, accompanied by 6 destroyers, would slip their moorings and begin a 30-hour transit to home ports in Germany. Air cover would commence at dawn. Additional escort vessels would join the fleet as it moved up the Channel coast. It is a bold and unheard of operation for the German Navy, he said. It will succeed if orders are strictly obeyed. At 20:30 hours, just as the crews were casting off, the air raid sirens began to wail. A flight of RAF Vickers Wellington bombers had arrived over Brest, not because anyone had detected the fleet's movements, but as part of the routine RF harassment campaign that had been pounding the harbour for months. It was, in retrospect, an almost cosmic coincidence. On the one night in years, when it mattered that the ships leave precisely on schedule, Bomber Command arrived at exactly the wrong moment for the Germans, and the exact right moment for no one. Ciliax ordered the operation suspended. He stood on the bridge of Scharnhorst and waited. 90 minutes passed. The bombers dropped their loads, well clear of the harbour as it happened, and departed. At 22:14 hours, permission to proceed was granted. The Brest group got underway at approximately 22:45 hours. Leading the column was destroyer Z-29. Then came Scharnhorst, then Gneisenau, then Prinz Eugen. 2 more destroyers deployed on each flank, and Z-25 fell in at the rear. The ships were already more than 2 hours behind schedule, a fact that would matter more than anyone on either side, fully appreciated in the hours that followed, because it meant the timing of their passage through the Dover Strait, so carefully calculated to place them in the Narrows at the most defensible hour, would now be offset by exactly those 2 hours. On Scharnhorst's bridge, the officer of the watch, a young officer named Wilhelm Wolff, asked the ship's navigator, Helmuth Gisler, for the course to steer. Gisler called for a starboard turn to 340 degrees. Wolff looked at the heading and paused. That course pointed directly into the English Channel. He questioned it. "The course is correct," Gisler told him, and there was something almost wry in the account of what came next. "Tomorrow you will be at home with your wife." It is the kind of small human moment that large official histories tend to omit, and it matters here because it captures something true about that night. The mixture of fear and dark humor and professional fatalism that carried those men through the dark hours. At 2:12 hours on the morning of the 12th of February, Admiral Ciliax spoke to his ship's companies by loudspeaker. He told them the truth. The Führer had summoned them to new tasks in other waters. The mission would demand a supreme effort from every man. It was the kind of address that naval officers have been giving before dangerous operations for as long as there have been navies. Formal, measured, stripped of the sentimentality that the moment might otherwise invite. Out on the open decks, in the cold Channel dark, the men listened. Then they went back to their stations. The fleet was making 29 knots. By 2 in the morning, they had passed Ushant and entered the English Channel proper. Prinz Eugens Fritz Otto Busch wrote afterward of what it looked like from his deck. The night was black, and the destroyers and E-boats were in position. Now and again, their shadows could be seen gliding past like ghosts. There was not much to be seen of the battleships. They were sailing on ahead, swallowed by the darkness. The Channel Islands slid past in the darkness at 5 in the morning. By that point, there was no going back. The next stop, Ciliax had said, must be home waters. Meanwhile, the British early warning network was in the process of failing so comprehensively that it bordered on the improbable. The submarine Celian, stationed off Brest, had submerged during the RAF bombing raid, and its commander, Lieutenant Commander George Colvin, had used the gap to surface and recharge his batteries, moving away from the harbour mouth at the precise moment the German ships were leaving it. The first Hudson Patrol aircraft from 224 Squadron, which should have been flying the Stopper patrol line between Brest and Ushant, had its radar break down during an encounter with a Ju-88 and returned to base. A replacement was not airborne until 2240 hours, by which time the German fleet had already cleared the line. A second Hudson, covering the line southeast patrol area, also suffered radar failure and returned to base at 2139 hours. 2 radars, 2 failures, on the same night. Neither failure was communicated in time to the other patrol crews. The British first, second, and third lines of early warning had all effectively dissolved before midnight. Chapter 5. The morning they were not seen. Dawn broke over the English Channel at approximately 7:45 on the morning of the 12th of February 1942. Signal lamps flashed between the German ships. A moment of professional routine in what was by now a highly abnormal situation. 5 minutes later, right on schedule, Colonel Gallen's fighters arrived from astern, dropping recognition flares before climbing to operational altitude and beginning the broad figure 8 patterns that would keep the fleet covered throughout the day. The air operation, Donnerkeil, was working exactly as planned. Down on the water, the fleet had grown considerably since leaving Brest. E-boats and torpedo boats from Cherbourg, Le Havre, and Cap Grisnez had joined the column through the night, until the armada now numbered roughly 60 vessels of various sizes. 60 vessels, moving northeast at close to 30 knots, through the English Channel. At 8:35, Admiral Bertram Ramsay, the same officer who had organised the Dunkirk evacuation less than 2 years earlier, and who now commanded the naval forces at Dover, received his morning briefings. Nothing unusual had been reported. Nothing was on the plots. He gave the order for his units to stand down to 4 hours readiness until the following night. The decision was completely rational given the information available to him. It was also, as history would record, the exact wrong call at the exact wrong moment. Within the hour, everything would change. But by then, the Germans were already past the point where any British surface force could intercept them. The British radar network was supposed to be the backstop, the line of detection that would catch what the submarines and air patrols had missed. Radar stations along the south coast had theoretically sufficient range to detect ships along the French coastline. But that morning, the Heinkel He-111 bombers carrying Luftwaffe radar jamming equipment had been operating along the Channel coast since before dawn, and their transmissions, introduced gradually over preceding days, so that British technicians were already used to the interference, were having a pronounced effect. Operators at the Beachy Head station changed shifts at 8 in the morning. The fresh operators noticed enemy aircraft flying in unusual circular patterns off the French coast and reported it. An hour later, they went blind again. What the British radar network was seeing in those patches of clarity was the outer ring of Gallen's fighter umbrella. The ships themselves remained masked by the jamming and by weather. The weather that morning deserves its own paragraph. The Channel in February is rarely hospitable, and the 12th was a particularly grey and fractious day. Decreasing visibility, westerly winds building to a moderate gale, intermittent rain squalls, a heavy swell that made the smaller escort vessels pitch violently. These were conditions that hampered British air reconnaissance far more than they hampered the German surface fleet, which had been designed for exactly this kind of North Sea environment. The German Ju-88 pilot, Gerhard Krumholtz, flying dawn patrol over the fleet, described the scene from his cockpit as the armada moved through the turbulent water. Majestically and calmly, they moved through the turbulent sea, surrounded by numerous security vessels. He noted that the British appeared, at that hour, to be asleep. They were not asleep, but they were looking the wrong way. At 8:45, 2 Spitfires of No. 91st Squadron took off from Hawking to fly the Habbo Line, the southernmost air patrol, stretching from Le Havre to Cap Gris-Nez. The pilot on the northerly leg saw nothing. The other pilot spotted E-boats leaving Boulogne heading southwest, noted them in his log, and turned for home at 9:04 without realizing that those E-boats were sailing out to join the fleet he was supposed to be looking for. He had been at most a few miles from the Scharnhorst. He turned for home and reported E-boat movements, and the report was absorbed into the general background noise of Channel activity. The actual visual detection of the German fleet came not from any organized patrol, but from 2 Royal Air Force officers who were, technically speaking, out on a training flight. Group Captain Victor Beamish and Wing Commander Boyd of RAF Kenley were doing what experienced pilots did during quiet periods, keeping their hands in, maintaining currency, flying over the Channel in the misty morning. They nearly flew into 2 other Spitfires from Hawking, who had also spotted the fleet. Beamish described the moment afterward with a controlled understatement that belongs to a specific kind of British military culture. We were about 5 miles off the French coast near Le Touquet. I saw 2 ships roughly in line astern, surrounded by about 12 destroyers, circled again by an outer ring of E-boats. Messerschmitts immediately attacked them. Both pilots took evasive action, and then, following standing RAF orders that would later be hotly debated, turned for home in complete radio silence to avoid alerting the Germans that they had been seen. The problem with that decision is that the Germans had already seen them. The radio silence, maintained as per standard procedure to prevent the enemy from realizing their fleet had been detected, lost the British approximately 30 critical minutes. By the time Beamish and Boyd landed and their sighting report worked its way through the chain of command to the people who needed to act on it, it was past 10:30. The German fleet was northeast of Calais. It was moving at approximately 30 knots. And the British, who had just been handed the first hard confirmation that the Channel Dash was happening, were about to discover how comprehensively unprepared they were to do anything about it. The first formal alert, reaching the naval headquarters at Dover, produced one of the stranger moments in the whole story. An officer, realizing that the contingency plan needed to be activated, contacted the London-based Air Ministry and said the single word Fuller into the telephone. The persons who answered said there was no one of that name there and hung up. It is the kind of detail that historians sometimes resist, including because it sounds too much like fiction. But it is documented and it matters, not because one confused telephone operator changed the outcome of the battle, but because it stands as a precise emblem of what had gone wrong with the entire British response. A system that had been built in secrecy, distributed across multiple commands, and never tested under realistic conditions, confronting a crisis that required it to function perfectly on the first try. Chapter 6. The hour Britain tried to respond. The clock on the wall at Dover Naval Headquarters read roughly 11 in the morning, when the full weight of what was happening finally settled on the senior officers present. By that point, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Prinz Eugen had been at sea for over 12 hours. They had cleared Brest, transited the Bay of Biscay, passed the Channel Islands, navigated the approaches to Cherbourg, and were now northeast of Calais, practically through the narrowest part of the Channel, the Strait of Dover, the historic choke point that was supposed to be the killing ground, if the British plan ever needed to be executed. The fleet had roughly 200 miles left to go before it cleared the Dutch coast, and the British, who had been building Operation Fuller for weeks, had approximately whatever time it took those ships to cover 200 miles to stop them. Admiral Ramsay was a meticulous and professional officer. He understood immediately that he was in an impossible position. The heavy units of the home fleet were in Scotland, far too distant to intercept. His destroyers at Harwich were at sea on independent exercises and would need time to concentrate. The Beaufort torpedo squadrons of Coastal Command were at Lucias and St. Val, hours away. What he had immediately available were the motor torpedo boats at Dover and Ramsgate, and the 6 Swordfish torpedo biplanes of No. 825 Naval Air Squadron, based at Manston in Kent, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond. None of these forces were well suited to a daylight attack on heavily escorted capital ships, with 60 aircraft overhead. Ramsay knew this. He requested that 125 squadrons stand down. The first Sea Lord, Admiral Pound, refused. The enemy was to be attacked wherever and whenever he was found. The motor torpedo boats went out first. Lieutenant Commander Edward Pumphrey led 5 serviceable craft out of Dover at approximately 12:20, running up to 36 knots, with 2 motor gun boats ordered to follow as soon as their commanders could be located. They were ashore. Pumphrey's flotilla spotted the enemy at 12:23. The E-boat screen was dense, the sea was rough, and the main ships were thousands of yards beyond the screen, well outside the ideal torpedo range of 2,000 yards. Pumphrey's own boat developed engine trouble and began dropping behind. He signaled the others to continue and fired his torpedoes in the general direction of the leading battlecruiser from long range. The other MTBs were driven back by the E-boat screen and Luftwaffe fighters that dropped to sea level to strafe them. One boat, commanded by a young Australian lieutenant named Saunders, somehow threaded through the screen and got inside it, firing his torpedoes at perhaps 3,000 yards at Prinz Eugen. A large column of water rose beside the cruiser. Saunders thought he might have hit her. he had not. 3 more motor torpedo boats from Ramsgate, under Lieutenant Long, left harbour at 12:25 and failed to reach the heavy units at all, coming up only against the rearguard E-boats disappearing northeast into the murk. Then the coastal artillery at Dover opened fire at 12:19. The 4 9.2-inch guns at South Foreland had the range, just barely, and fired 33 rounds in 17 minutes. Not one fell within a mile of the enemy. The gunnery officer aboard Prinz Eugen was heard to remark, "Well, that wasn't much, was it?" It was not a cruel observation. It was simply accurate. It was in this context: MTBs driven back, shore batteries firing blind, radar jamming still disrupting the plots, that Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond received the order to take his 6 swordfish against the fleet. This requires some description of what the swordfish actually was in 1942, because there is a temptation to romanticize it. The fairy swordfish was a biplane. It had a maximum speed of approximately 115 knots at full throttle. It was fabric covered. It had been designed in the early 1930s. By February of 1942, it was so thoroughly obsolete that Galland's pilots, who had spent the previous years fighting hurricanes and Spitfires, initially refused to believe that the aircraft coming toward them were actually going to attack the fleet. In a normal war, these machines would not have been within 100 miles of 3 capital ships under 60 fighter cover. Esmond knew what he was leading his men into. Admiral Ramsay had contacted him through the RAF liaison officer, Group Captain Constable Roberts, to convey the message that the final decision was Esmond's own. It was the kind of official communication that offers a man a choice, while making clear what the only acceptable answer is. Esmond came from a Southern Irish family with a long military tradition. His half-brother Geoffrey had died at Ypres, and honour in that family was not an abstract concept. He told Constable Roberts to advise Ramsay that the attack would be made. The plan called for 5 full squadrons of Spitfires to cover the Swordfish attack. When Esmond's 6 aircraft took off at 12:34, having waited 9 minutes beyond the planned departure time for fighters that had not arrived, he had 10 Spitfires with him. 10 against 40 Messerschmitts. The Swordfish crossed the destroyer screen at 80 knots, straight and level, because the torpedo attack required a straight, level approach. The first 3 aircraft flew in arrowhead formation led by Esmond himself. The German anti-aircraft fire came up in curtains. The first flight crossed the screen. Scharnhorst's 11-inch guns fired a carpet barrage ahead of the approaching biplanes, using their main battery, their ship-killing guns, against aircraft, because those aircraft were getting close enough that it seemed warranted. Esmond's aircraft began trailing smoke. His port lower wing was shot away. He wrestled the controls. His crewmen were already dead. He released his torpedo at under 2,000 yards, and his Swordfish crashed into the sea. The torpedo missed. Of the 18 men who flew in those 6 Swordfish, 13 did not return. The Luftwaffe battle diary for that day described the courage of the Fleet Air Arm crews. The men flying fabric biplanes at 80 knots through cannon fire and 11-inch gun barrages, as surpassing any other action by either side that day. Eugene Esmond was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the United Kingdom's highest honour for military valour. Admiral Ramsay, watching from the shore, wrote to the Admiralty that the attack by 825 Squadron constitutes one of the finest exhibitions of self-sacrifice and devotion to duty that the war has yet witnessed. The ships sailed on. The Strait of Dover was behind them. Ahead lay the North Sea, the Dutch coast, and home. End of chapters 1 through 6. Chapters 7 through 18 to follow, continuing with the Harwich destroyer attack, bomber command's failures, the mine strikes, the arrival at Wilhelmshaven and Kiel, the British inquiry, the strategic aftermath, and the later fates of all three ships. If you are still with us, and if you have drifted towards sleep somewhere in the middle of the Strait of Dover, that is entirely the right outcome. Know that the story is not finished. The Scharnhorst is about to hit a mine. The destroyers from Harwich are racing at full steam through their own minefields to cut her off. And somewhere in Whitehall, Winston Churchill is about to receive a briefing that will ruin his morning. Stay with us, or sleep. We will be here when you wake up. Chapter 7. The Destroyers of Harwich. The 5 destroyers of the 19th Destroyer Flotilla had been at sea since the previous morning on an anti-submarine sweep, routine work, the kind of duty that fills the vast majority of a wartime sailor's career with patient, unrewarded vigilance. Their commander, Captain Mark Pizzey, had received the first fragmentary intelligence of the German breakout while his ships were still north of the Thames estuary, and the orders that reached him at approximately 11:30 that morning contained the particular combination of urgency and inadequate information that characterizes a command structure caught genuinely off guard. He was told that 3 large enemy ships, heavily escorted, were moving northeast through the channel. He was told to intercept an attack. He was not told their precise position. He was not told what air cover he could expect. He was given, in effect, a heading and a mandate, and left to work out the rest. What Pizzey had under his command were 5 vessels: Campbell, Vivacious, Worcester, Walpole, and Whitshed. A 6th destroyer, Mackay, joined the group shortly after they got underway from Harwich. So the final attacking force numbered 6 ships. These were not the most modern vessels in the Royal Navy's inventory. The V&W class destroyers that made up the bulk of the group had been commissioned in the early 1920s, nearly 2 decades old, built for the First World War's tactical concepts, and upgraded as best as the interwar budget had allowed. They could make 27 to 29 knots in reasonable sea states, but the channel in February was not a reasonable sea state. A westerly swell was running. The visibility came and went in squalls, and the destroyers were working hard just to hold formation. Pizzey drove them northeast at maximum speed, plotting a course he hoped would place him as head of the German fleet somewhere off the Dutch coast. There was an additional problem that Pizzey was, understandably, reluctant to discuss in detail in his after-action report, though naval historians have drawn it out through later research. His planned intercept course took the destroyers through, or very close to, minefields that the Royal Navy had itself laid along the channel approaches. These were British mines, charted by British officers, and the charts Pizzey was working from indicated safe lanes through them. But the confidence that could be placed in those charts, on a grey February morning at 27 knots in a building sea state, was finite. He was asking his crews to sprint through partially charted mine belts to intercept an enemy fleet that would be surrounded by 60 aircraft, dozens of escort vessels, and the combined firepower of 3 capital ships. This required the kind of professional calculation that reduces to a single question: is it worth it? The answer, for Pizzey and for every officer in his flotilla, was never seriously in doubt. Pizzey's group sighted the German fleet at approximately 15:30 hours, in deteriorating visibility with mist and cloud, reducing the ceiling to a few hundred feet. What he saw, looking east-northeast, was an enormous mass of ships. The 3 capital ships forming the core, ringed by destroyers and E-boats, with aircraft moving overhead in the low cloud. He had 6 destroyers, each with 4 torpedo tubes. He had roughly 8 minutes from the moment of sighting to the moment when geometry and speed would make a torpedo attack geometrically impossible. He formed his destroyers into line abreast and went in. The German E-boats raced out to meet him, and the air above his ships filled with aircraft. Messerschmitt Bf-100s and W190s dropping to mast height to strafe the attacking force. The noise was, by every account, extraordinary. Scharnhorst's secondary armament opened up. Shell splashes rose all around the British destroyers. Campbell, leading the line, fired her torpedoes first. Then Vivacious, then Whitshed and Mackay. Walpole was driven back by aircraft and E-boats before she could get inside effective range, but she turned and fired at extreme range. Worcester was the last ship in the line, and she pressed the attack further than any other vessel, closing to within what her captain estimated as under 3,000 yards. Well inside what military doctrine considers point blank for a destroyer torpedo attack against capital ships. She took 2 direct hits from large caliber shellfire and 1 near miss that bent her bow plating. 26 of her crew were killed. She was left dead in the water. She did not sink, but she would play no further part in the day. Not a single torpedo hit. 24 torpedoes were fired by the Harwich destroyers. The German fleet's evasive maneuvers, executed with a precision that speaks well of the training, Ciliax had demanded. Through the torpedo tracks, clear of every hull. The E-boat screen had forced the British destroyers to fire from longer ranges than ideal. The visibility was poor, and the speed and geometry of the engagement gave the German helmsman enough time to comb the torpedo tracks. It is worth sitting with that sequence of numbers for a moment. 6 Swordfish torpedo bombers, 24 destroyer torpedoes, 30 torpedo attacks in a single day, 0 hits on the capital ships. The Channel Dash was not won by the Germans purely through boldness. It was won through the precise, sustained execution of protective measures that gave the enemy almost no opportunity for a clean shot. Pizzey turned his remaining destroyers back toward Harwich through the gathering dusk, with Worcester limping behind under tow. He had done exactly what his orders required. He had found the enemy and attacked. The result, which he reported with a directness that characterizes his entire account, was nil. There is a particular quality of professional stoicism in the after-action reports, written by men like Pizzey on the afternoon of the 12th of February, and it is worth noting. They do not make excuses. They describe what they saw, what they did, and what happened. The evidence suggests that everyone in the Harwich flotilla understood exactly what kind of odds they had gone into, and everyone came back with the same assessment. We did what could be done with what we had, and it was not enough. What no one in the Harwich flotilla yet knew, and what would only become clear in the following hours, was that the German fleet had, in fact, already suffered its first real blow, not from British weapons, from the sea itself, and from the very thing that Commodore Rouge had warned about at the Wolf's Lair 3 weeks earlier. At approximately 14-15 hours, while the destroyers were still racing to intercept, the flagship Scharnhorst had struck a British magnetic mine, laid in the swept channel south of the island of Terschelling. The explosion had lifted the bow of the ship several feet from the water, knocked officers off their feet, blown out electrical systems across 3 decks, and jammed the rudder. The ship's speed had dropped immediately from 27 knots to 8. She was temporarily almost unmaneuverable. For approximately 30 minutes, While Ciliax frantically signaled for engineering reports and medical, teams worked below decks. The entire plan was on the edge of collapse. The mine, the one thing Rouge had specifically warned Hitler, could not be reliably swept, had done what 30 torpedo attacks had failed to do. And then Scharnhorst's engineers, in what every account describes as a genuinely remarkable feat of damage control, reported that the flooding was contained. The rudder was freed. The speed climbed back slowly, past 15 knots, past 20, back toward operational. Ciliax transferred his flag to the destroyer, Hermann Schoeman, to give himself a faster command platform, while Scharnhorst regained her stability, then train transferred back once it was clear the ship would make it. She was down in the bow, she was flooding in places, and she would need dry dock attention once she arrived home. But she was moving, she was still in the game. And she had not been found by the British, who, in a failure of reconnaissance that by now had become the afternoon's dominant theme, did not know she had been hit. Chapter 8. Bomber Command's Afternoon, 300 aircraft. That is the number Bomber Command had allocated to Operation Fuller, the British contingency plan for exactly this moment. 300 aircraft, over weeks of planning, assigned to the theoretical task of stopping the German fleet if it broke out. By the afternoon of the 12th of February, 1942, with the German ships in the North Sea and a clear intelligence picture finally assembled at Air Ministry, those 300 aircraft had one clear assignment: find the fleet and sink it. What followed across the next 4 hours constitutes one of the more instructive case studies in the gap between planning and execution that military history provides. The fundamental problem was timing. The aircraft were not fueled and armed for anti-shipping operations when the crisis broke. They had been at standby, meaning weapons loads, and fuel states were configured for alternative missions. Converting 300 aircraft in a crisis, in February weather, across multiple airfields, with a moving target somewhere in the southern North Sea, is not the straightforward exercise that planning documents make it appear. Wing after wing reported delays. The first formations that actually got into the air and headed for the last reported position of the German fleet were fighting a ceiling of under 1,000 feet, a northwesterly wind that made accurate navigation difficult, and a visibility that went from poor to zero in the squalls running across the North Sea. The bomber crews who went out that afternoon were not, in the majority of cases, trained for anti-shipping work. They were accustomed to the precision, such as it was, of a target that was stationary and could be marked on a map. A fleet moving at 27 knots in poor visibility is a different kind of problem entirely. The RAF official history, published in the 1950s, contains a painful reckoning with what actually happened. Of the 242 sorties actually flown against the German fleet that afternoon and evening, note that this is already significantly below the 300 aircraft planned. Only 39 crews actually reported seeing the enemy. Of those 39, 17 were unable to make a valid bombing attack due to cloud or evasive action by the escort. The remaining 22 dropped bombs. No capital ship was hit. Several bombs fell close enough to be logged as near misses in the German records, but none caused damage of any consequence. The bombers themselves lost 17 aircraft to fighters and anti-aircraft fire, with additional losses in accidents and crash landings on return. The crews who went out that afternoon were not lacking in courage. Several accounts by RAF aircrew who participated describe pressing through Galland S-fighter umbrella to below 500 feet in an effort to improve bombing accuracy and the loss rates among those who did reflect what that kind of decision cost. What was lacking was training in anti-shipping procedures, adequate and timely intelligence on the fleet's position, fighter cover at the right altitudes to suppress the German combat air patrol, and a kind of coordination that transforms individual acts of bravery by individual crews into a massed, focused attack that a moving fleet cannot simply maneuver around. The attack on the 12th of February, 1942 was not one attack. It was 242 separate decisions made by individual crews, in individual cockpits, in terrible weather, loosely aimed in the direction of a fleet that was moving faster than most of the attacking aircraft had been briefed to expect. There was also the question of the Beaufort torpedo bombers, the specialist anti-shipping aircraft of Coastal Command that were supposed to be the primary weapon against heavy ships. Of the 73 Beauforts available across 3 squadrons, 14 actually located the fleet and attacked. 14. The rest turned back due to weather, lost contact in poor visibility, arrived at empty sea where intelligence said the fleet should be, and found nothing, or developed mechanical defects. The 14 that did attack pressed in against Gallen's fighters, and the combined anti-aircraft fire of the entire escorting fleet, and they fired their torpedoes from ranges and angles that gave the German ships adequate time to comb the tracks. No hits were scored. There is a historiographical point worth making here, because it bears on how the Channel Dash has sometimes been misread. Some post-war British accounts, and some popular histories, have treated the day's failures as reflecting specifically on the pilots and aircrew involved, an implied suggestion that better men might have done better. This is not the view that emerges from the primary sources, nor from the serious operational analyses that followed. The failures of the 12th of February were overwhelmingly structural. The wrong weapons, in the wrong places, inadequately trained for the specific task, directed through a command structure that was not integrated enough to mass effort at the critical point against a fleet that was better protected, better led, and moving through worse weather than anyone's planning assumptions had accounted for. The individual bravery, in many cases, was extraordinary. The system failed. Colonel Galland flew his last fighter shift over the fleet in the late afternoon as the ships began to approach the Dutch Friezen Islands. He wrote afterward that he had expected, throughout the day, that a massed British attack would eventually come, that somewhere, behind the ragged individual assaults, there would be a concentrated, coordinated strike that would overwhelm the fighter cover and give the torpedo bombers the space they needed. That attack never came. By evening, he wrote, we knew we had done it. The fighter umbrella had been maintained without a break across the entire Channel transit, a feat of organization that required careful handover of units at altitude, pre-positioned fuel and ammunition at French airfields along the route, and the kind of sustained logistical discipline that the German air operation had managed, in a way that the British response had not. It was not glamorous work, but it was decisive. As the light failed over the North Sea on the afternoon of the 12th of February, the German fleet was approaching the Dutch coast. The worst of the British response was over, spent and largely wasted against an enemy that had simply executed its plan better than its opponents had managed to disrupt it. The Scharnhorst was still moving, still flooded but stable, her engineers working below decks to keep her ahead of the flooding rate. Gneisenau and Prinz Eugen were undamaged and making full speed. The destroyer screen was intact. Galland's fighters had shot down 42 British aircraft over the course of the day. more than the RAF's more conservative estimates acknowledged at the time, though later research confirmed the German count. The question now was whether the mines of the Dutch and German coastal approaches would finish what the British weapons had not. They almost did. At approximately 1955 hours, with darkness already complete over the North Sea, Gneisenau struck a mine in the approaches to the Dutch coast. The explosion was larger than the one that had hit Scharnhorst. It blew a hole in the bow section large enough that Gneisenau's speed dropped sharply, and she began to ship water at a serious rate. Then, at 22:34, Scharnhorst struck a second mine. This second hit was worse than the first. Flooding in 3 compartments, power failures in the aft sections, turbine damage that dropped her to 10 knots. For the second time in 8 hours, the flagship of the German operation was in serious danger of being lost. Not to British weapons, but to mines laid months or years earlier in waters both sides were simultaneously contesting. That Scharnhorst made it home at all speaks to the quality of her damage control teams and the stubborn resistance of her engineering to the kind of punishment that would have stopped most ships. Chapter 9. The mine strikes and the long night. The night of the 12th into the 13th of February 1942 was not a quiet one for the men aboard Scharnhorst. The second mine strike had transformed the final stage of what had been, until that point, a largely successful transit into something considerably more uncertain. The ship was flooding. Her turbines were partially compromised. She was managing a speed that, at its best moments, reached 25 knots, and at its worst dropped below 10. The destroyers of the escort had tightened their screen around her, and the watch officers on her bridge were navigating some of the most heavily mined coastal waters in the northern European sea approaches, using charts that everyone aboard knew were incomplete. The temperature was below freezing, the swell was running high, and below decks, behind sealed watertight doors, damage control teams were working in compartments that nobody could be entirely certain would stay sealed. Vice Admiral Ciliax had already transferred his flag once. After the first mine strike, when Scharnhorst's bridge had been temporarily cut off from the engineering spaces, and reliable reports were impossible to obtain in real time. After the second mine strike, he remained aboard Scharnhorst, which was itself a statement of something. The flagship was going to make it home, or he was going to be on it when it did not. That is not sentimentality. It is professional naval culture of a specific kind, the culture in which a flag officer's presence on a damaged ship carries meaning beyond mere symbolism. It tells every man aboard that the chain of command has not decided the ship is expendable. It matters to the men in the engine rooms as much as the obvious danger matters to the man standing on the bridge, making the decision to stay. Gneisenau had taken her mine strike at approximately 1955 hours, as noted, in the approaches to the Dutch islands. Her damage, while serious, was more manageable than Scharnhorst's. Her forward compartments were flooding, but slowly, and her speed held at approximately 15 knots as her engineers assessed the situation. Prinz Eugen, which had so far come through the entire day entirely unscathed, was the fastest and least damaged ship in the group, and she had been dispatched ahead to make full speed for Brunsbüttel at the entrance to the Kiel Canal. The tactical logic was sound. Of the 3 ships, Prinz Eugen was the most maneuverable and the most capable, and her clean arrival in Germany could be held up as evidence of the operation's success, regardless of what happened to the battlecruisers behind her. There is a particular kind of seamanship required for the work that Scharnhorst's engineering officers were doing, on the night of the 12th. Damage control in a flooding ship in heavy weather, at night, at speed, is not reducible to any single dramatic moment. It is hours of readings taken in compartments that smell of seawater and electrical smoke, of calculations made about flooding rates and pump capacities and structural load limits, of decisions about which doors to seal and which compartments to sacrifice in order to preserve buoyancy where it matters most. These men were not in the narrows of the channel, dodging torpedoes. They were in the working spaces of a badly hurt ship, doing technical work of extraordinary difficulty, with the knowledge that if they got the calculations wrong, the ship and everyone on it went down in the North Sea in February. They got the calculations right. The British, meanwhile, were discovering the full extent of what had happened across a night and day of progressive intelligence failure. Reports were assembling at the Admiralty and at Air Ministry that painted a picture nobody wanted to see. The radar jamming had been deliberate. That much was becoming clear from the patterns. The decoy measures at Brest had worked. The patrol submarines had missed the departure. The air patrols had failed. The shore batteries had missed. The motor torpedo boats had missed. The swordfish had been slaughtered. The destroyers had fired 24 torpedoes without a hit, and 242 bombing sorties had produced no damage to any capital ship. The Germans had, furthermore, apparently got through without a single vessel of the main group lost. The mine strikes were not yet known on the British side. That intelligence would only filter through later. And so the picture that formed at the Admiralty, in the early hours of the 13th, was one of complete and unrelieved failure. Winston Churchill was woken before dawn to be briefed. His reaction has been reported in various forms by his wartime associates, and the precise words have been debated. This is one of those cases where the post-war memoir literature and the contemporary record diverge in ways that make exact quotation difficult. What is not debated is the general tenor of his response, which was controlled fury. He had known, at an intelligence level, that the breakout might come. He had not been told, because the intelligence was still being processed at Bletchley, that Enigma intercepts had been pointing clearly toward it for weeks. In the morning, he would face the House of Commons, and the House of Commons would want to know how 3 large German warships had sailed through the English Channel in daylight. And the Royal Navy had not stopped them. The German propaganda machine moved faster. By the morning of the 13th, Berlin radio was broadcasting a triumph. German newspapers ran banner headlines. Photographs of the ships under Gallen's fighter umbrella were released. The propaganda ministry presented the Channel Dash as proof of German naval mastery and British impotence. A triumphant homecoming for the Reich's finest ships, achieved against the full weight of British air and sea power. The images were real. The framing was, as propaganda framing always is, selective. It omitted the mine strikes, the flooding below decks, the dead and wounded aboard Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, the engineering crises that had repeatedly threatened to end the operation in catastrophe before the ships ever reached home. Scharnhorst anchored off Wilhelmshaven in the early hours of the 13th, too badly damaged to enter the port under her own power until temporary repairs could be made to her flooding compartments. Gneisenau made it to the Elbe estuary. Prinz Eugen arrived at Brunsbüttel and passed through the Kiel Canal to the Baltic without incident. The operation was complete. All 3 ships had reached Germany. But it is worth noting, and serious German naval historians have noted it, that Scharnhorst required months of dry dock repair before she was operational again, and Gneisenau's mine damage was followed so quickly by bomb damage in subsequent RAF raids that she never fired her guns in anger again. The triumph was real. Its dimensions were somewhat narrower than the propaganda suggested. The men who had made it home went ashore in the grey German winter morning to find themselves famous. There were ceremonies, decorations, official photographs. Ciliax was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves. Galland was credited with a masterpiece of fighter management. The dockyard workers who received the damaged ships were told nothing about the mine, strikes, and some accounts suggest that even within the Kriegsmarine, the full extent of the structural damage to the two battle cruisers was not widely known outside the engineering departments. Victories in the middle of a total war tend to be reported in their best possible light. The men who knew how close it had come kept their own counsel. Chapter 10. The British Inquiry. The public storm broke immediately. On the morning of the 13th of February, the British press, which had not yet been officially briefed on what had happened, was already running fragments of the story based on German radio broadcasts. Questions were asked in the House of Commons before Churchill had the chance to frame the issue. The Times of London, which had been one of the great voices of British confidence in naval affairs for more than a century, ran an editorial that is remembered in the naval historical literature for a particular phrase. It compared the German passage through the Channel to the days when Dutch Admiral D. Ruyter had sailed up the Medway in 1667 and burned the English fleet at its moorings. It was not a gentle comparison. Churchill responded to the House of Commons on the 13th with a statement that managed to be factually accurate while communicating as little as possible about the deeper failures involved. He confirmed that the German ships had passed through the Channel. He confirmed that British forces had attacked. He stated that the Germans had sustained damage, which was true. The mine strikes had been confirmed by that point from various intelligence sources, and he pledged that a formal inquiry would be held under the chairmanship of a suitable authority. He did not say that ultra intercepts had pointed toward the operation for weeks. He could not say that because ultra was the most closely guarded secret in British possession, and mentioning it would have told the Germans that their Enigma traffic was being read. He therefore stood in the House of Commons and accepted responsibility for a failure he could not fully explain. The inquiry was chaired by Admiral Sir William James, a retired officer whose career gave him both the experience and the necessary distance from the immediate command chain to conduct a meaningful review. James and his panel spent 3 weeks taking testimony from every relevant officer and examining the operational records in detail. What they produced was a document that is careful, thorough, and, in the way of official inquiries conducted by people who understand that careers and reputations are at stake, notably restrained in its conclusions about individual responsibility. The panel found fault with the radar watchkeeping procedures. It found fault with the communication protocols between RAF and Royal Navy commands. It found fault with the disposition of Beaufort torpedo aircraft. It found fault with the 4-hour readiness posture that Ramsay had adopted on the morning of the 12th. And it praised, explicitly and in specific terms, the courage of the Swordfish crews and of the Harwich destroyer force. What the James inquiry was careful not to do. And here is where historians since have gently pushed beyond its findings, was trace the failures to their deepest structural roots. The separation of command between Coastal Command, Bomber Command, and the Royal Navy was not invented for the Channel Dash. It was a permanent feature of the British warfighting structure in 1942 inherited from decades of inter-service rivalry and never resolved by any authority below the level of the Prime Minister himself. To have said in a formal inquiry report that the command structure of the British Armed Forces was fundamentally inadequate for the coordinated defence of the home coastline would have required a political intervention of the First Order. The James inquiry said, in effect, that the system had not worked well on this occasion, and certain procedures should be improved. It stopped short of the obvious implication. The Air Ministry convened its own separate inquiry, and here the findings were somewhat blunter. The assessment of Bomber Command's performance against the fleet was, in internal circulation, devastating. The aircraft had not been properly tasked. The crews had not been properly trained for anti-shipping work. The coordination with Coastal Command had been inadequate, and the tactical doctrine for attacking a defended fleet in low visibility at sea with high-altitude bombers was, frankly, not fit for purpose. Several of these findings eventually worked their way into genuine operational changes. The expansion of Coastal Command's dedicated strike wing, the development of the torpedo bomber concept more seriously, the improvement of radar-equipped maritime patrol aircraft. But none of these changes happened quickly enough to matter in the immediate crisis. They were the long-delayed harvest of a lesson that could have been learned, and partially was learned, by men like Campbell and Esmonde much earlier. The inquiry into the failure of the radar network produced results that were, in some ways, the most troubling of all. The Heinkel jamming aircraft had not been doing anything technically novel. Their transmissions were within the understood range of radar countermeasures. What they had done was exploit a specific vulnerability in the British operator training and procedure, the tendency to attribute interference to natural causes before considering deliberate jamming, and the absence of a rapid escalation protocol for reporting anomalous radar readings up the command chain. This was a doctrinal and training failure, not a technological one. The Germans had simply found a hole in the British procedure and walked through it. The inquiry recommended specific improvements to operator training and anomaly reporting. Those improvements were implemented. The next time a German fleet tried to sail through the channel, it would face a different problem. But the next time never came, in large part because of decisions made in Berlin in the weeks after the Channel Dash that made the Channel Dash itself strategically self-defeating. There was, in the midst of all the official scrutiny and political embarrassment, the question of what to do about the men who had fought. Eugene Esmond's Victoria Cross was gazetted on the 3rd of March, 1942. 5 of his surviving aircrew, there were 5 survivors from 18 men, received conspicuous gallantry medals. Captain Peasy of the Harwich destroyers was mentioned in dispatches. The motor torpedo boat crews received similar recognition. Admiral Ramsay wrote personally to the families of the dead from 825 Squadron. There is something in those letters, in their careful, formal acknowledgement of what each man had attempted and what it cost, that the official inquiry reports do not carry. The inquiry was about systems. The letters were about people. Both were necessary. They addressed different things. Captain Pizzy's own account of the afternoon, given in testimony to the James panel and later reproduced in part in the official histories, contains a detail that has stayed in the naval historical record. He was asked whether he believed, when he led his destroyers in against the German fleet, that he had a realistic chance of hitting the capital ships. He paused before answering, according to the testimony record. Then he said that realistic chance was perhaps not the right frame for the question. He had a duty, he said, and the duty was to attack. Whether it was likely to succeed was a question for the planners. His job was to execute. It is the kind of answer that courts of inquiry sometimes receive from men who have been in the places that inquiry panels tend only to read about, and it tends to close that line of questioning rather quickly. The public inquiry findings were published in a sanitized form. The classified annexes, which dealt with ultra and with the full extent of radar jamming, remained secret for decades. What the public received was a broad Strox's account of what went wrong. Communication failures, timing problems, unfavorable weather. It was enough to satisfy the immediate political demand for accountability, without exposing the deeper intelligence and command failures that would have been genuinely damaging to the war effort. Churchill, who understood the gap between the public account and the full story, accepted the partial disclosure as a necessary wartime compromise. History, he believed, would produce a better reckoning in due course. He was right. Chapter 11: What Germany Won and What It Lost. The strategic aftermath of the Channel Dash is one of the more instructive cases of a tactical, success-producing consequences that were mixed, at best, for the side that executed it. In the immediate term, Germany had successfully repositioned 3 capital ships from a port that was increasingly untenable to waters where they could, in theory, serve the strategic purpose Hitler had identified: the defense of Norway and the interdiction of Arctic convoys. Prinz Eugen reached Trondheim in late February, though she was torpedoed by a British submarine shortly afterward, and had to return to dry dock. Scharnhorst spent months in repair and did not reach operational readiness again until late in 1942. Gneisenau, after being bomb-damaged again in the dry dock at Kiel following the Channel transit, was never returned to operational service as a warship. Her guns were removed and her hull was eventually used as a block ship. Let that last detail settle for a moment. Gneisenau, one of the 2 ships whose menacing presence at Brest had tied down significant British forces, whose Atlantic raids had sunk 22 merchant vessels, and whose passage through the Channel had produced a propaganda triumph of the First Order, was decommissioned within months of the Channel Dash and never fought again. The operation that was supposed to make her available for the war in Norwegian waters succeeded in bringing her home in a condition so badly damaged that she could not be repaired in any operationally useful time frame. The mine that hit her in the Dutch approaches, combined with the subsequent bomb damage, ended her career as a fighting vessel. The ship that German propaganda had photographed steaming triumphantly through the Channel had, within 4 months, become a floating gun battery and, later, a block ship. She was scuttled in March of 1945. This is the strategic paradox at the heart of the Channel Dash that serious military analysts have returned to repeatedly since 1942. Admiral Raeder had argued, before the operation, that the ships at Brest, whatever else could be said about them, were performing a strategic function by existing and by threatening. They were tying down British forces. They were, in his phrase, a fleet in being. The moment they moved, they became a fleet in transit, and then a fleet in dry dock, and then a fleet in varying states of unserviceability. The theoretical benefits of the Norwegian deployment: suppressing the Arctic convoy routes, deterring Allied landings, never fully materialized because the ships that were supposed to provide those benefits were unavailable for most of the period during which they might have been needed. Hitler characteristically saw this rather differently. For him, the Channel Dash was a political and propaganda success, and propaganda success had strategic value in a war whose outcome was still theoretically undecided in February of 1942. Germany needed victories. The Channel Dash was a victory, or at least it could be presented as one, and in a totalitarian state where the presentation of events was as important as the events themselves. That was not a trivial consideration. He was not wrong to see political value in it. He was wrong to assume that the ships would be able to deliver the operational value he expected from them in Norwegian waters. That assumption was driven by a fundamental misunderstanding of how badly the Channel transit had damaged the very assets he was repositioning. There is a British perspective on the strategic aftermath that is often underplayed. The Channel Dash, for all its immediate embarrassment, had one significant strategic consequence that worked in Britain's favour. The German heavy ships were no longer at Brest. They were no longer threatening the Atlantic convoy lanes. From the moment Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Prinz Eugen disappeared into the Baltic and Norwegian approaches, the specific threat they had posed to Atlantic convoys, the threat for which the fleet in being concept had been so effective, ceased to exist. The Kriegsmarine's surface radar threat in the Atlantic did not disappear entirely, but it was substantially reduced. Grand Admiral Raeder understood this and said so, repeatedly, in private assessments that make painful reading. Given that he had predicted exactly this outcome before the operation was approved, the First Sea Lord, Admiral Pound, noted in a private memorandum that is preserved in the naval records that the Channel Dash had effectively traded a significant and sustained strategic threat, Atlantic raiding capability, for a tactical humiliation that was painful but temporary. The ships were home, yes. They were in dry dock, yes. But they were no longer in the Atlantic, and in the longer calculus of the Second World War, in which the Battle of the Atlantic was the campaign that Churchill later said came closest to defeating Britain, the removal of that specific threat was not a trivial gain. He did not make this argument publicly for obvious reasons. Publicly, the Channel Dash remained a humiliation that had to be addressed. Privately, Pound's assessment was that the Germans had given up more than they knew. The psychological dimension of the aftermath is harder to quantify, but impossible to ignore. For the Royal Navy, the Channel Dash produced a crisis of institutional confidence that took months to work through. The Navy that had defeated Napoleon, that had maintained the sea lanes for the British Empire across a century, that had blockaded Germany in the First World War and driven the U-boats back from the trade routes. That Navy had just been unable to stop 3 ships from sailing through its own front garden. The officers who lived through the 12th of February carried that with them. Some of them never stopped thinking about it. It changed the way certain problems were approached. Certain procedures were designed. Certain assumptions were questioned. That kind of institutional learning is slow and painful, and rarely produces the clean, dramatic lesson that after-action reports prefer. But it is real, and it mattered. For the Kriegsmarine, the aftermath produced a different kind of reckoning. Raeder had been proved right in almost every detail of his objections to the operation, and he had been overruled, and the operation had succeeded, technically speaking, which meant that his objections had been proved wrong in the only metric that Hitler recognized. The ships were home. He could not take credit for predicting the damage, because the damage was being managed, and the propaganda was running. He could not point to the strategic cost, because in February of 1942, with the German army still fighting far into Soviet Russia, and the war's ultimate outcome still genuinely uncertain, the cost had not yet fully manifested. He filed his assessments. He continued his correspondence with Hitler about the proper use of naval power. He would resign in January of 1943, after the Battle of the Barents Sea, in a final disagreement about exactly these questions. But that is a story for another documentary. Chapter 12. The fate of the ships. Of the 3 ships that sailed through the English Channel in February of 1942, each met a distinct end. And those ends, spread across the remaining years of the war, tell a more complete story of what the Channel Dash actually meant than any single day's events could provide. Prinz Eugen survived the war, which makes her, in some ways, the most fortunate of the 3. She was torpedoed by the British submarine HMS Trident on the 23rd of February 1942, just 10 days after the triumphant arrival at home, taking a hit that blew off her stern section and killed 50 of her crew. The damage was severe enough to require months of repair at Kiel. She returned to limited service, participated in several sorties in the Baltic, and eventually survived to the war's end as one of the very few major German surface combatants still afloat and functional. The United States Navy took her as a war prize, and she was subsequently used as a target ship in the atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll in 1946. She survived 2 atomic explosions and was eventually sunk by gunfire in 1948 after the accumulated radiation made it impossible for crews to board her for towing. She rests, still, on the bottom of Kwajalein Atoll. Gneisenau's story after the Channel Dash is one of the more poignant in the Kriegsmarine's record, for reasons that have nothing to do with heroism or triumph. She arrived at Kiel in damaged condition, went into dry dock, and on the night of the 26th and 27th of February, barely 2 weeks after the Channel Dash, was struck by 3 bombs during an RAF raid that killed 72 of her crew and caused damage of a severity that the German naval staff assessed, in private, as requiring at minimum 6 months of repair. The decision to repair or to decommission was debated for weeks. Hitler, who had just claimed a great triumph with these very ships, was reluctant to acknowledge that one of them was effectively out of the war, but the engineering assessments were unambiguous. Gneisenau was paid off into reserve in July of 1942. Her twin 11-inch turrets were removed and emplaced as coastal batteries in Norway, which was, in retrospect, a grim irony. The ships had been rushed home to defend Norway, and now parts of one of them were being embedded in the Norwegian coastline as static gun positions. Scharnhorst had the longest active career after the Channel Dash, and the most dramatic end. After months of repair at Wilhelmshaven, she was declared operational again in the second half of 1942, and eventually deployed to Norwegian waters, as Hitler had always intended. She participated in several sorties against Arctic convoys, with mixed results. She became, by 1943, the most important remaining surface unit of the Kriegsmarine. The Tirpitz was present in the fjords, but chronically plagued by mechanical problems and the constant threat of Allied commando and air attack. Scharnhorst was the ship that actually went to sea, actually engaged the enemy, actually tried to function as the aggressive naval force that Hitler had always demanded from his surface fleet. On the 26th of December, 1943, the day after Christmas, Scharnhorst sortied from Altafjord in northern Norway to attack the Allied convoy JW55B. She did not return. Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser, commanding the home fleet aboard HMS Duke of York, had been tipped off by ultra-intelligence that Scharnhorst was at sea, and he had positioned his force, 2 cruisers and a covering group including Duke of York and several destroyers, to intercept. The ensuing action, known as the Battle of the North Cape, lasted most of a bitter Arctic day. Scharnhorst was first crippled by gunfire from Duke of York's 14-inch guns, which hit her main machinery spaces and dropped her speed dramatically. Then she was surrounded by destroyers, which pressed in close enough to fire torpedoes at ranges that did not allow for evasion. She sank in the late evening of the 26th of December with the loss of 1,936 men. 36 survivors were rescued from the Arctic water. The contrast between the Channel Dash and the Battle of the North Cape is one that naval historians have used to make a specific point about the development of British anti-ship coordinations across the war years. In February of 1942, the British had not been able to coordinate submarines, surface ships, aircraft, and coastal artillery into a functioning response against a German breakout through their home waters. In December of 1943, barely 22 months later, they intercepted Scharnhorst using exactly that kind of multi-layer, intelligence-driven coordination. Ultra providing warning, cruisers driving her away from the convoy, the fleet flagship delivering the decisive blow, destroyers finishing the job. The institutional learning that the Channel Dash had forced had, within less than 2 years, produced a force capable of exactly the kind of coordinated, intelligence-led naval killing that Operation Fuller had spectacularly failed to deliver. The officers who were most affected by the failure of the 12th of February found different ways to live with it. Admiral Ramsay, who had done his duty and attacked with the forces he had, and who had written that painful letter to the Admiralty after the Swordfish attack, went on to command the naval forces for the Allied landings in North Africa in 1942, then Sicily in 1943, then the greatest amphibious operation in history at Normandy in June of 1944. He was killed in an aircraft accident in January of 1945, before the war's end, and never had the opportunity to see the full arc of what the Royal Navy became. After the lessons of February 1942 had been incorporated into its doctrine and practice, he was a careful, thorough, unshowy officer, and the contrast between the chaos of the Channel Dash and the precision of the Normandy naval operation, which landed more than 150,000 men in a single day with coordinated naval gunfire, minesweeping, and amphibious management of an entirely different order of complexity, is in some ways his most complete professional statement. The German officers who had executed the Channel Dash found that triumph had a shorter half-life than they had expected. Ciliax was promoted and eventually reached the rank of General Admiral, but the ships he had so successfully shepherded through the Channel were, one by one, removed from active service, sunk, or consigned to dry dock before the war was over. Galland, whose fighter management on the 12th of February had been genuinely brilliant, remained in the Luftwaffe's upper ranks, fought the entire war, and ended it as one of the first jet fighter pilots, commanding the Me-2 62 Squadron in the last weeks of 1945. He wrote a memoir after the war, The First and the Last, which contained a relatively modest account of the Channel Dash air operation. Modest because Galland was a fighter pilot, and the Channel Dash was primarily a navigation and logistics problem, dressed up in fighter cover, and he knew the difference. Prinz Eugen rests today beneath 12 meters of water in the Kwajalein Lagoon in the Marshall Islands. Her starboard propeller was recovered in the 1970s and is displayed at the Naval Memorial in Laboe, Germany. Gneisenau's anchor is preserved. Scharnhorst is in roughly 72 meters of water at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, northeast of North Cape. She is an official war grave, and under Norwegian law, she may not be disturbed. Those 1,936 men are still aboard her. The Channel Dash was the high point of their war. The North Cape was its end. The distance between those two events, in time, roughly 22 months. In outcome, everything, is the distance between what the Channel Dash actually was and what it was said to be. 6 more chapters remain ahead of us. We will spend time with Esmonder's family and with the survivors of 825 Squadron. We will look carefully at the ultra secret and what it means that Britain knew and still failed. We will ask, as the best naval historians of the 20th century asked, whether the Channel Dash was a German victory or a strategic own goal, and we will end where we began, with those grey ships in a grey channel and the question of what it means when the most professional navy in the world meets a more careful plan than it prepared for. There is more to come. Rest if you need to. We are not going anywhere. Chapter 13. The man who flew into the guns Eugene Esmond was 32 years old on the 12th of February, 1942. He had been awarded the Distinguished Service Order at Buckingham Palace the previous day, the 11th of February, by King George VI himself, for his role in the attack on the Bismarck 9 months earlier. He had then returned to Manston in Kent, to the 6th Swordfish of 825 Naval Air Squadron, and he had spent the evening in the officers' mess. The following morning, within 12 hours of receiving his decoration, he was leading those same 6 aircraft into the most concentrated anti-aircraft fire and fighter cover that the Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe had assembled in the English Channel. Whether the timing of the decoration and the attack, separated by less than a day, was coincidental or represented the particular brutal efficiency of wartime administration, it stands as one of those biographical details that history offers with the quiet insistence of something that should be noticed. Esmond's life before the 12th of February is worth understanding, because it tells you something about why that particular man on that particular morning did what he did. He was born on the 1st of March, 1909, in Yorkshire, to a family of Southern Irish Catholic gentry, the Esmondes of County Wexford, with a military tradition stretching back across centuries. His father was a medical doctor. His mother came from a family where service was not a career choice, but something closer to an inheritance. He was commissioned into the Royal Air Force as a pilot officer on the 28th of December, 1928. At the age of 19, he became a flying instructor. He left the service in 1934 and joined Imperial Airways, where he trained as a flying boat pilot. Those enormous, graceful machines of the interwar years that flew passengers across oceans in measured, deliberate stages. He was good at precision. He was good at patience. He was, by all accounts, a quiet and methodical man who inspired confidence in the people who flew with him, precisely because he never seemed to be performing the act of being brave. In January of 1939, the Admiralty wrote to him. The newly formed Royal Naval Air Branch needed experienced pilots, and Esmonde's record made him exactly the kind of officer they were looking for. He joined, underwent refresher training at the Royal Naval Air Station at Lyon-Solent, and was assigned to 750th Naval Air Squadron by May of 1940. The same month, Germany began its advance into France and the Low Countries. He had taken command of 825 Naval Air Squadron aboard HMS Furious. He led attacks against German-occupied Trondheim and Tromsø in Norway. He was the kind of officer who accumulated experience, the way careful craftsmen accumulate skill. Steadily, without drama, through repeated encounters with genuinely difficult things. By the time he was leading his swordfish against the Bismarck, In May of 1941, he had been flying in anger for more than a year. The Bismarck attack is a necessary part of understanding Esmonday's biography because it establishes something that the Channel Dash sometimes obscures. On the night of the 24th of May, 1941, Esmond led 825 Squadron from HMS Victorious in a torpedo attack against the Bismarck, a ship that displaced over 50,000 tons fully loaded, that was moving at speed through the North Atlantic, and that was covered by some of the most comprehensive anti-aircraft fire any Kriegsmarine vessel had ever carried. The Swordfish flew through it. One torpedo hit. The damage was not decisive. The Bismarck was eventually sunk by other means, but the attack was pressed home under conditions that would have justified turning back. And the Distinguished Service Order that Esmond received for it reflected what that kind of professional resolve was worth to an institution under wartime pressure. He then transferred to HMS Ark Royal, where he continued to fly operations until that ship was torpedoed by a German submarine in November of 1941. He was among the last men to leave the Ark Royal before she went down. When 825 Squadron was assigned to Manston in Kent in early 1942, it was in the process reconstituting after the losses aboard Ark Royal. The 6 Swordfish at Manston were not a full operational squadron. They were what remained while the unit rebuilt. The original Operation Fuller Planning had assigned far more torpedo aircraft to the Channel Watch. But as the weeks passed without a German breakout, and as the pressure of a global war reassigned assets to more immediately pressing theatres, those resources had been quietly removed. By February of 1942, 825 was the only torpedo aircraft unit still physically positioned to intercept the German fleet in the Dover Strait. 6 aircraft, 18 men, 1 torpedo each. The 5 survivors of the attack have each left some account of what it was like inside those cockpits. Sub-Lieutenant Brian Rose, who survived though wounded, described the approach in terms that have been quoted in virtually every serious account of the action. The fighters came first, then the anti-aircraft fire built as they crossed the escort screen, then the capital ships opened up with everything they had, and then the world reduced to the small immediate business of keeping a fabric biplane flying straight toward a target at 80 knots, while the air around it was being systematically destroyed. The surviving records of the attack describe each Swordfish taking multiple hits before any of them crossed the destroyer screen. The aircraft that made it through to torpedo release were, by that point, barely airworthy. Wings damaged, controls impaired, observers and air gunners dead or wounded in their cockpits. They flew on because the man leading them had not turned. Esmond's body was recovered from the River Medway in late April of 1942, several weeks after the attack. He was buried at Woodlands Cemetery in Gillingham, Kent. His Victoria Cross was gazetted on the 3rd of March, 1942, awarded, as the citation reads, for the brilliant leadership of an enterprise that surpassed the highest traditions of the Royal Navy. It is the language of official citation, which means it carries only a fraction of the actual weight. What the citation cannot fully convey is the quality of the decision that Esmond made, not the heroic decision, which is how it tends to be remembered, but the professional one. He was not unaware of the odds. He had been flying torpedo attacks against heavily escorted capital ships for nearly a year. He understood, in more precise terms than most of the people who would later write about the action, exactly what 80-knot biplanes flying in formation could expect from 60 fighter aircraft and the combined secondary batteries of 3 capital ships. He made the calculation. He gave the order. He flew. 4 of the 5 survivors were awarded the Distinguished Service Order. The 5th, who was the only man to emerge from the action entirely unwounded, was awarded the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal, the naval equivalent for non-commissioned officers of the Victoria Cross. Their names were Brian Rose, Edgar Lee, Charles Kingsmill, Pat Gifford, and Donald Bunce. Each one had flown through what the German battle diary called the most extraordinary act of collective courage it had witnessed in the war's aviation campaigns. Each one had been inside an aircraft that was being destroyed around them, while they kept it straight and level for torpedo release. Each one had been in the water afterward, in the English Channel in February. Until they were picked up, they all lived. The 13 who did not have no single monument dedicated specifically to them, but they are named on the Fleet Air Arm Memorial at Lyon-Solent, on a wall that lists the dead of a service that flew obsolete aircraft against modern fleets for 3 years before anyone in authority had the decency to give them better ones. The historiographical debate about whether the attack was justified, whether sending 18 men in 6 biplanes against that fleet served any rational military purpose, has been running since 1942 and has never fully resolved. The official line, then and now, is that the attack had to be made because the enemy had to be engaged. And that is not entirely without merit. There is a real argument that failing to engage at all would have had consequences for naval morale and institutional culture that went beyond the immediate tactical result. The counter-argument, made by several serious military historians, and not lacking in force, is that the order to fly was issued knowing the outcome was not in doubt, and that the responsible exercise of command authority includes the option to withhold forces from missions that will destroy them without result. Neither argument fully closes. They sit beside each other in the record, unresolved, as those kinds of arguments tend to do when the men who could speak to them most directly are no longer living. Chapter 14, The Ultra-Secret and the Intelligence Failure. The role of signals intelligence in the Channel Dash has been, since the declassification of the relevant records, beginning in the 1970s, one of the more carefully studied aspects of the entire operation. The basic facts are these. The program at Bletchley Park, known as Ultra, which derived intelligence from the exploitation of the German Enigma cipher machine, had been producing usable intelligence about German naval movements for roughly 18 months before the Channel Dash. In late January of 1942, Ultra Intercepts had identified Kriegsmarine minesweeping operations in the English Channel. Operations that pointed clearly toward an imminent transit of some kind. In early February, further decrypts described the channel route as the most probable direction for any German breakout from Brest. This information reached the relevant British intelligence authorities. It did not, in any usable form, reach the operational commanders in time to change the outcome. The reason it did not is both specific and important. The processing of Naval Enigma at Bletchley Park in early 1942 was not a real-time operation. The analysts and mathematicians working on the daily keys, the settings that the Germans changed every 24 hours, meaning that each day's traffic had to be broken fresh, were working with the most sophisticated code-breaking operation in history. But even that operation had a processing lag. The intercepts for the 10th, 11th, and 12th of February, the 3 days that encompassed the Channel Dash itself, were not decrypted until the 15th of February, 3 days after the ships had arrived in Germany. The intelligence was there, encoded in the signal's traffic that British listening stations had captured and forwarded to Bletchley. But the people who could turn that traffic into usable operational intelligence were working faster than they had ever worked before, and were still 3 days behind. There is a deeper problem here that the simple timeline does not fully capture. Even the earlier intercepts, the late January ones describing minesweeping, the early February ones pointing toward the channel, had not been processed and forwarded to operational commanders in a form that allowed for immediate action. The system for converting ultra-intelligence into operational briefings involved multiple layers of handling, designed primarily to protect the source. If an operational commander knew, in specific terms, what the Enigma traffic said, he might act in ways that revealed to the Germans that their cipher had been broken, and protecting the secrecy of Ultra was, correctly, assessed as worth almost any operational cost. The result was that intelligence was filtered, sanitized, delayed, and sometimes simply held back when the risk of source exposure was judged to outweigh the operational benefit. On this occasion, those judgments produced a catastrophic gap between what was known in principle and what could be acted upon in practice. The national security agencies declassified historical analysis of the Channel Dash, a document not available to the public until the late 20th century. Puts it plainly, the Channel Dash is a case study in the importance of timely intelligence. Intelligence that arrives after the event it was meant to prevent. Has occurred is not, operationally speaking, intelligence. It is history. The Bletchley analysts were not failing at their jobs. They were being asked to break military-grade encryption in real time with the most advanced mathematical tools available in 1942 against an adversary that changed its keys daily and whose operators had been trained to use the Enigma correctly. The fact that they were capable of breaking it at all was extraordinary. The fact that it was occasionally 3 days late was not a failure of the people involved. It was a structural limitation of what was, even at its best, an imperfect tool operating at the edge of human capability. What historians have argued more energetically about is the question of what happened to the intelligence that was available in time. The late January and early February material describing minesweeping and likely routes. The evidence suggests that this intelligence reached the intelligence liaison officers at the relevant headquarters, at the Admiralty, at Coastal Command, at the Air Ministry, in a form that was accurate but necessarily vague. The sources could not be named. The confidence level could not be precisely stated. The message, as it arrived at operational planning level, was something along the lines of, there are indications of preparations for a channel transit, which, to a planning officer already operating on the assumption that a channel dash would be suicidal, was consistent with preparatory harassment and deception rather than genuine intent. The intelligence pointed in the right direction. The assumptions of the people who received it bent it in the wrong one. This is a phenomenon that historians of intelligence call the problem of the mosaic, the idea that individual pieces of intelligence only become meaningful when assembled with other pieces into a complete picture, and that the assembly process is itself shaped by the prior beliefs of the assembler. The British planners were not stupid. Several of them were extraordinarily capable. But they had spent months watching the German ships at Brest absorb RAF bombs, and they had watched the Bismarck be hunted down in the Atlantic, and their professional model of German naval behavior included a deep assumption that German commanders would not willingly accept the risks of a channel transit in daylight. When intelligence pointed toward exactly that transit, It had to overcome not just the ambiguity of source material, but the gravitational pull of a professional model that had been built on reasonable evidence and was, in this one specific case, simply wrong. The ultra failure at the Channel Dash produced lasting changes in the way Bletchley Park's output was integrated into British operational planning. After February of 1942, significant effort went into reducing the processing lag for naval Enigma traffic, a technical and organizational problem that the Bletchley teams worked on continuously across the following years. The handling procedures for ultra-derived intelligence were also revised to allow more timely, if still carefully protected, communication to operational commanders when the intelligence was judged time-critical. These changes did not eliminate the fundamental tension between source protection and operational utility. That tension is inherent in all intelligence work and has never been fully resolved. But they reduced the gap between collection and action to something more operationally usable. By the time of the North Cape engagement in December of 1943, the ultra-intelligence about Scharnhorst's movement reached Admiral Fraser in time to allow him to position his force for interception. That improvement had its origins, in part, in the lessons of February 1942. The deeper question that the ultra failure raises, and that the serious intelligence historians have not fully answered, is whether better timed intelligence would actually have changed the outcome. The operational situation on the morning of the 12th of February was not primarily an intelligence problem. The British knew, once the fleet was spotted by Beamish and Boyd around 10:30, exactly what was happening and where it was happening. They had roughly 4 hours to stop it. What they lacked in those 4 hours was not information. They had information. They lacked the right weapons in the right places, with the right training, under a unified command capable of massing effort at the critical point. Ultra could have told them, with perfect clarity, that the ships were leaving Brest on the night of the 11th. That knowledge alone would not have given them the Beaufort torpedo bombers they did not have at Dover, or the fighter coordination they needed over the fleet, or the command unity they had never built. The intelligence failure was real, and it mattered. But it was not the only failure, and possibly not the most important one. Chapter 15. What the Channel Dash changed. Every significant operational failure in wartime produces, somewhere in the machinery of the military institution it embarrasses, a set of changes. Some of those changes are cosmetic. Procedures updated, responsibilities reassigned, lessons learned on paper that are forgotten in practice within a year. Some are genuine. The Channel Dash produced both kinds. The easiest changes to document are the organizational ones, a new arrangement for the command of anti-shipping operations in the Channel area, clearer protocols for the coordination of Coastal Command and the Royal Navy's shore-based forces, improved procedures for reporting radar anomalies, and, perhaps most importantly, the accelerated development of dedicated anti-shipping strike wings equipped with modern aircraft. These things happened, they are documented, and they made a measurable difference to the effectiveness of British anti-shipping operations in the subsequent years of the war. The harder changes to document are the conceptual ones. The shifts in how senior British officers thought about naval warfare and about the relationship between intelligence, planning, and execution. The Channel Dash forced a reckoning with a set of assumptions that had been accumulating, unexamined, since the end of the First World War. The Royal Navy had entered the Second World War with a deep institutional confidence in its own traditions and methods. A confidence that was, in many respects, well-founded in experience. It had also entered the war with a tendency to plan for the enemy it expected, rather than the enemy it might face, and to distribute its available forces according to the threats it considered likely, rather than the threats that were theoretically possible. The Channel Dash exposed the cost of that tendency in a single afternoon. The fleet that the Admiralty had thought no rational German commander would attempt to move through the Channel had been moved through the Channel. The lesson was not that German commanders were irrational. It was that the British had not fully reckoned with how differently a German commander might calculate acceptable risk. The development of the RAF's dedicated anti-shipping strike capability after February of 1942 is one of the more direct institutional responses to the day's failures. Coastal Command's torpedo bomber force was significantly expanded and re-equipped over the following 12 months. The Bristol Beaufighter, a twin-engine aircraft fast enough and robust enough to survive the anti-aircraft environment around a defended fleet, was introduced to the anti-shipping role and became, by 1943, a genuinely effective weapon against Axis coastal convoys. The tactics were refined, low-level attacks, coordinated with cannon-armed aircraft that suppressed anti-aircraft fire, while the torpedo aircraft ran in. These were not elegant, conceptual innovations. They were the direct, practical conclusions drawn from the specific ways that the anti-shipping attacks of the 12th of February had failed. Too slow, too high, too exposed, too uncoordinated. The answer to each of those failures was worked out, one by one, in the training establishments and planning rooms of the following months. The Royal Navy's anti-submarine and mine warfare capabilities also developed significantly in the period following the Channel Dash, though the connection to the specific events of February 1942 is less direct. What the Channel Dash had demonstrated in the mine strikes on Scharnhorst and Gneisenau was that British magnetic mines were capable of damaging capital ships, even when those ships were following professionally swept channels. The Kriegsmarine's minesweeping teams had reduced the mines in the transit corridor to a level that celiacs had accepted as operationally manageable, and yet both capital ships had still been struck. This was noted by the British mine warfare departments, and the continued development of more effective and more difficult to sweep magnetic and acoustic mines was given increased priority in the subsequent period. The mine program, quietly and without publicity, became one of the more effective passive defences of British home waters in the war's later years. The changes in British naval command structure were slower and more politically difficult than the changes in equipment and tactics. The fundamental problem, the absence of a single officer responsible for the coordinated defence of the Channel, was acknowledged in the James Inquiry and addressed, partially, through the expansion of Ramsay's authority at Dover. But the deeper structural issue, which was the division of responsibility between the Royal Navy and the RAF over anti-shipping operations, was not cleanly resolved until well into 1943, when a series of command conferences produced a clearer delineation of authority and, more importantly, established regular joint planning procedures that gave the two services a shared operational picture rather than two parallel ones. These changes did not have the drama of a new ship or a new weapon. They were administrative. They were also, in the long run, more important than most of the hardware decisions made in the same period. One of the more striking long-term consequences of the Channel Dash is what it did to the career of Admiral Bertram Ramsay. He had commanded the Dover forces on the 12th of February. He had sent the swordfish out. He had watched the Harwich destroyers fire and miss. He had, in the narrow professional sense, presided over a failure of some magnitude. And yet, within the following 2 years, he would be appointed to command the naval forces for the invasion of North Africa, then Sicily, then Normandy, 3 of the most complex amphibious operations in the history of naval warfare. The reason is not mysterious. His superiors recognized that the Channel Dash failure was a systemic one, not a personal one, and that Remé's conduct throughout the crisis, methodical, honest, professionally competent, under impossible conditions, was exactly the kind of conduct they needed in an officer who would be planning operations where the margin for error was similarly narrow and the consequences of failure similarly severe. They were right. The Normandy naval operation, Operation Neptune, coordinating the movement of more than 150,000 men across open water with naval gunfire, minesweeping, and amphibious management of extraordinary complexity, was executed without the catastrophic coordination failure that had characterized Operation Fuller. The lesson had been learned by the right man. The Germans drew their own lessons from the Channel Dash, though not always the ones that would have served them best. The operation had validated Hitler's intuition that bold, unconventional action could succeed against a cautious, assumption-bound opponent, and that validation made him, if anything, more likely to override the considered professional judgments of his naval staff in the future. Raeder, whose objections had been proved strategically correct, even as the operation succeeded tactically, found his institutional position with Hitler weakened rather than strengthened by the outcome. The Führer had backed an unconventional gamble against professional advice, and the gamble had worked in the most visible sense. The ships were home, the propaganda was running. That pattern of outcome tends to reinforce exactly the decision-making habits that produce it. For Hitler, it confirmed what he already believed, that he understood war better than the admirals did. In January of 1943, after the Battle of the Barents Sea, he sacked Raeder entirely. The lesson he took from the Channel Dash was the wrong one. Most of the strategic lessons he took from military success were. Colonel Adolf Gallen's professional assessment of the operation, set down in his post-war memoir and in subsequent interviews with naval historians, is notable for what it emphasizes. He was proud of the fighter operation. He had good reason to be. It was, by any objective measure, an extraordinary achievement of continuous air cover management across a full day's transit through the most heavily watched stretch of water in Europe. But he consistently pointed out, in his various accounts of the day, that the British had been given multiple opportunities to mass a decisive attack and had not taken them. His tone in these passages is not triumphant. It is something closer to puzzlement mixed with professional respect. The puzzlement of a man who had spent the day waiting for the coordinated strike that would test his fighter umbrella to its limit, and who had gone home that evening still waiting. He never stopped believing, he said, that a properly organized British response could have at minimum damaged the fleet severely. The British simply had not been able to organize one. In his quiet way, Gallen seemed to find that almost as interesting as winning. Chapter 16. The Survivors and the Sea. There is always, after the official histories have been written, and the inquiries have concluded, and the decorations have been gazetted, a different kind of history. It is made of smaller pieces, letters, photographs, post-war interviews with men who were present and who carried specific memories that no official document records. The Channel Dash, like all events of this kind, left that second history in the keeping of its survivors. And by the time serious, oral historians began collecting those accounts in the 1970s and 80s, many of the men who had been present were elderly, and some of the memories had the particular quality of things that have been carried in silence for a long time. Sub-Lieutenant Brian Rose, one of the 5 survivors of 825 Squadron, gave several interviews in the decades after the war. His accounts are notable for their precision. The precision of a man who has revisited the same sequence of events many times and has settled over the years on exactly what is known and what is reconstructed. He described the approach to the fleet in terms that emphasize the noise more than anything else. A physical, enveloping quality that he said is impossible to convey to someone who has not been inside it. The German accounts of the attack described the swordfish crews as flying with unimaginable bravery. Rose's own accounts tend to omit the word bravery entirely. He describes instead what was seen, what was done with the controls, what was heard. The quality of the courage is present in the texture of the description, rather than in any explicit claim to it. That is the particular register of the men who actually flew those aircraft, and it says something about the kind of training they had received and the culture that produced them. The men who served on the German ships also left accounts, though they are less widely accessible in English language sources. Petty officers and ordinary ratings who served aboard Scharnhorst and Gneisenau during the transit gave testimony to German oral history projects in the 1970s and 80s, and fragments of those accounts have made their way into the secondary literature. Several of them describe the swordfish attack with a mixture of professional astonishment and personal discomfort that reads, across the decades, as genuine. The German sailors watching those aircraft fly toward them knew what they were doing. They fired everything they had at them because those were their orders, and because the ship's survival required it. That they found the experience difficult to think about afterward is evident in how they described it. Several used the same word, unwirklich, unreal. The men of the Harwich destroyers left a smaller documentary trail, because their engagement, though it was pressed with equal resolution, did not produce the same concentrated drama of the swordfish attack. Captain Pizzy's after-action report is the primary source, and its professional terseness is, in its way, as eloquent as anything the Fleet Air Arm survivors recorded. He lists what was done, what was ordered, what the results were. He does not describe what it looked like from the bridge of Campbell when Worcester took her hits and stopped dead in the water astern. The crew of Worcester, who had pressed their attack further than any other vessel in the flotilla, lost 26 dead and a significant number of wounded in a few minutes of engagement. Their commanding officer brought the damaged ship home without further loss. He received a mention in dispatches. In the context of that day, that was the going rate for pressing a torpedo attack to within 3,000 yards of 3 capital ships. The men who flew with Bomber Command that afternoon are, in some respects, the least remembered participants in the Channel Dash. Not because their contribution was unimportant, but because it is the most difficult to fit into a clean narrative. They were not Esmondi's biplanes, flying straight into certain fire. They were not Pizzy's destroyers, pressing through an E-boat screen at speed. They were 300 aircraft, or 242 sorties, depending on which count you use, that dispersed into a grey February sky, and mostly did not find what they were looking for. The ones who did find it pressed their attacks. 17 of them did not come back. Their stories are distributed across the operations records of dozens of squadrons, written in the language of mission reports, that were not designed to preserve the individual experience. They were doing a job that they had not been properly trained for, in aircraft that were not designed for it, against a target they could barely see in conditions that made accurate navigation impossible. Most of them failed. Some of them died failing. The distinction between their courage and that of the swordfish crews is not in degree. It is in visibility, and visibility is what history tends to preserve. The motor torpedo boat crews at Dover, Pumphrey's 5 vessels, and Long's 3 occupy a particular place in the record. They were the first British forces, actually, to engage the German fleet in a direct attack, and their engagement, pressed across an E-boat screen in the middle of the day, in poor visibility at 36 knots, was characterized by precisely the initiative and aggression that the larger operations conspicuously lacked. Pumphrey's own boat had engine trouble. He ordered the others to continue. He then fixed the engine, continued himself, and fired his torpedoes from long range before the E-boat screen drove him back. The Australian officer, Lieutenant Saunders, who threaded through the screen and got inside it, getting closer to the capital ships than almost any British combatant that day, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The accounts of his approach describe what it looked like from inside. The shell splashes, the E-boats turning to cut him off, the brief geometry of a torpedo run that required everything to happen right at once. Nothing hit. He came back. He was 23 years old. A particular kind of institutional memory that navies carry about their operational failures, and it is different in character from the memory they carry about their victories. Victories tend to be formalized, commemorated, narrated, built into the founding mythology of the institution. Failures tend to be processed through the mechanisms of the inquiry and the after-action report, and then consigned to the institutional basement. Available to the historians who go looking for them, present in the collective professional knowledge of the officers who studied them in staff colleges, but rarely surfaced in the public ceremonial of institutional self-presentation. The Channel Dash sits in that basement space in British naval history. It is taught. It is studied. It is, in the relevant professional communities, thoroughly understood. But it is not commemorated in the way that Trafalgar is commemorated, or the way the sinking of the Bismarck is remembered. It happened. It was absorbed. It was used. The institution that endured it became, in specific and measurable ways, better at the things the Channel Dash had revealed it was doing badly. That is what serious institutions do with their failures. And the Royal Navy, in this case, was a serious institution. The 5 survivors of 825 Squadron went on to continue the war. Brian Rose survived and went on to further service. Edgar Lee, who had been wounded in the attack and pulled from the Channel water, recovered and returned to operational flying. Of the 5, all survived the war itself, which, given the nature of Fleet Air Arm operations in the remaining 3 years of the conflict, was not a foregone conclusion. Esmonde's Victoria Cross eventually went to the Fleet Air Arm Museum at Arnas-Yeovilton in Somerset, where it remains today. His name is on the memorial at Leon Solent. His entry in the official Victoria Cross records is brief and precise. The attack he led on the 12th of February, 1942, was made in the face of tremendous odds with the utmost courage, skill, and determination. Those are the words of the citation. They are accurate as far as they go. They do not go nearly far enough. Chapter 17. The strategic reckoning every historical event eventually reaches the point where the immediate participants are gone, and the event itself, recedes into something that professional historians argue about, rather than something that surviving witnesses remember. The Channel Dash reached that point some decades ago, and the arguments that have accumulated around it in the historical literature are, in several respects, more revealing about the nature of naval warfare than the events themselves. The central argument is about what the Channel Dash actually meant, whether it was a German victory or, in some deeper strategic sense, a German mistake that was temporarily disguised as a triumph by the quality of its propaganda and the extent of British embarrassment. That argument has never fully resolved, because both sides of it are, in different respects, correct. The case for the German victory reading is straightforward. 3 major warships, representing a significant fraction of the Kriegsmarine's total capital ship strength, were successfully repositioned from a harbour that was becoming operationally untenable to waters where they could serve the strategic purposes their commander-in-chief had identified. The operation was executed against the full weight of the world's most experienced navy and a substantial portion of its air force, in conditions that the British had specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of breakout. Not one ship was lost. The British response was comprehensively defeated at every level. The propaganda benefit was real and immediate, and the repositioning, in purely physical terms, accomplished exactly what Hitler had ordered. The ships were no longer at Brest and were, at least in principle, available for deployment to Norwegian waters. The case for the strategic own goal reading is more complex, but, on balance, more persuasive. Gneisenau never fought again. Scharnhorst spent the better part of 9 months in dry dock before she was operational. Prinz Eugen was torpedoed 10 days after arrival and spent months under repair. The fleet-in-being effect that the ships at Brest had exerted on British strategic planning, the way that their mere presence had forced the retention of significant home fleet units and constant RAF attention, was immediately dissolved the moment they entered the Baltic and Norwegian waters, where they posed a different and, in practice, less immediately threatening strategic problem. The Atlantic convoy threat, which had been the most concrete justification for the fleet-in-being strategy, disappeared, and the German surface fleet never meaningfully operated in the Atlantic again after February of 1942. The ships that were supposed to go to Norway and conduct an aggressive campaign against Arctic convoys mostly sat in fjords, absorbing supplies and trained crews that the Wehrmacht desperately needed elsewhere, conducting occasional sorties that were cancelled when the risk was assessed as too high. The Channel Dash freed them from Brest and penned them into a different kind of inactivity. Grand Admiral Raeder's post-war memoir, My Life, published in the 1950s, contains his most complete statement of what he believed the Channel Dash had cost Germany. He had argued against the operation, been overruled, watched it succeed in its immediate tactical objective, and then watched the subsequent months confirm every strategic concern he had raised. He is not vindictive about it in the memoir. He is too professionally careful for that. But the argument is present throughout. A fleet-in-being is not valuable because of what it does. It is valuable because of what the enemy must do in response to the possibility of what it might do. The moment you move the fleet, you end the possibility. You have traded the enemy's permanent uncertainty for a one-time tactical result. Whether that trade is worth making depends entirely on whether the one-time tactical result achieves something the uncertainty could not achieve. In the Channel Dash's cases, Raeder believed it did not. The subsequent history of the German surface fleet, Tirpitz sitting motionless in a key Norwegian fjord until she was eventually destroyed by Lancaster bombers in November of 1944. Scharnhorst going down at the North Cape, Gneisenau in dry dock as a gun platform, suggests he was right. The broader question that the Channel Dash raises about the relationship between tactical success and strategic outcome is one that the military theorists have been examining since at least the early 19th century, and it did not begin or end with the Kriegsmarine in February of 1942. Clausewitz, whose ghost haunts every serious discussion of operational military history, made the point that tactical results derive their meaning from their relationship to the political objectives they serve, and that a tactical success which does not advance the political objective is, in the deepest sense, no success at all. The Channel Dash advanced Hitler's immediate political objective of having the ships at home rather than at Brest, and it produced a propaganda triumph that served his broader narrative of German invincibility. Whether it advanced Germany's strategic position in the war is a different question, and the evidence suggests it did not. The ships that came home damaged eventually stopped fighting. The Atlantic threat they had represented, and which, had it been properly developed with the full support of the German naval construction program, might have been genuinely decisive in the struggle over British supply lines, was abandoned for the lesser ambition of Norwegian coastal defence. Churchill's own post-war assessment of the Channel Dash, in the relevant volumes of his memoir of the Second World War, is characteristically layered. He acknowledges the embarrassment. He is precise about the intelligence failure within the limits of what he could still reveal when writing in the early 1950s. He notes, carefully and without emphasis, that the removal of the ships from Brest was, from the British perspective, not without strategic advantage. He does not make the point heavily. The political context of the early 1950s did not reward a British Prime Minister, describing a naval humiliation as secretly advantageous, but it is there in the text, available to the reader who is looking for it. Churchill, who had been First Lord of the Admiralty in both World Wars, and who understood naval strategy at a level most politicians never approach, knew what Raeder had known. The ships in the Channel had been more dangerous to Britain at Brest than they would ever be in the Baltic. He was, to the extent that any British political leader could be, glad to see them go, even at the cost of how they went. The debate about the Channel Dash that has occupied historians since the 1970s has increasingly focused on the question of intelligence, not just the ultra failure, but the broader question of how intelligence and planning interact in a command system under the pressures of real operational time. The Channel Dash is now regularly taught at staff colleges on both sides of the Atlantic as a case study in exactly this problem. How does a planning system that has been built on a set of reasonable assumptions fail when those assumptions are wrong? The answer that the Channel Dash provides is not a comfortable one, because it suggests that the failure mode is not dramatic or obvious. It does not announce itself. The British system on the 12th of February was not visibly broken. Each individual component, the radar operators, the patrol aircraft, the submarine commanders, the MTB flotillas, the planning officers at Ramsay's headquarters, was doing roughly what it was supposed to do. The failure was in the spaces between the components, in the handoffs that did not happen, and the communications that did not arrive, and the assumptions that no one thought to question because they were shared by everyone. That kind of failure is the hardest to prevent. It is also the most instructive to study. Chapter 18. The long memory of a short passage history does not end cleanly. Events recede, but they do not disappear. They leave residue in the institutions, doctrines, and professional cultures that formed around them, and sometimes that residue matters more than the event itself. The Channel Dash of February 1942 is, 80-odd years later, still being taught, still being argued about, and still producing new angles of analysis as archives declassify and as the relevant disciplines, intelligence history, operational research, decision theory, develop new frameworks for understanding what happened that afternoon in the English Channel. It is the kind of event that remains productive for historians because it is genuinely ambiguous. It was a success and it was a failure, and the question of which of those things it was depends entirely on what question you are asking and over what time frame you are asking it. The physical remains of the Channel Dash are scattered across 3 continents. Prinz Eugen is at the bottom of Kwajalein Atoll, and her propeller is on display at the Naval Memorial in Labo, Germany. A strange kind of monument, one component of a ship separated from its context by half a world and 60 years, and the particular indignity of having survived 2 atomic bombs only to be sunk by naval gunfire as a target. Scharnhorst rests in roughly 72 meters of Arctic water, northeast of Norway's North Cape, a protected war grave under Norwegian law. She will not be disturbed. Gneisenau's remains are less clearly located. She was sunk as a block ship at the entrance to Gdynia harbour in March of 1945, and was subsequently broken up for scrap in the 1950s, leaving little physical trace of the ship that had sailed through the English Channel in triumph, and then spent the better part of 3 years unable to fight. The memorials to the British participants are similarly dispersed. Esmonde's Victoria Cross is at the Fleet Air Arm Museum at Yeovilton. The Leon Solent Memorial carries the names of the 13 men from 825 Squadron who did not come back from the 12th of February. There is no dedicated memorial specifically to the Channel Dash, in the way that some battles have a specific physical site associated. With them, the action did not happen in one place, and the participants were drawn from so many different units and services that creating a unified, commemorative site would require choices about whose sacrifice sends to center that the institutions involved have never fully agreed on. The annual commemorations that do take place at the Fleet Air Arm Museum, at the Manston History Museum in Kent near the airfield from which the swordfish flew, tend to focus on Esmond and 825 Squadron, which is understandable, because their story has the quality of concentrated tragedy that makes it accessible as a commemorative subject. The story of 242 bomber sorties in poor visibility is harder to gather into a single commemorative act. The town of Manston, where Esmonde's 6 swordfish had been based, maintained a local memory of the Channel Dash for decades after the war, in the particular way that communities near wartime airfields tend to maintain them. Through the informal testimony of people who had watched the aircraft take off, through local historical societies, through the preservation of the airfield's history. At the Manston History Museum, the museum holds records of the 12th of February and the aircraft that flew from its runways on that day, and these records have been consulted by every serious researcher who has worked on the Channel Dash in the English language literature. They are the kind of local, specific, granular archive that fills in the gaps that official documents leave. The timing of particular events, the weather as it was actually experienced at the airfield, the accounts of ground crew, who watched the swordfish disappear into the murk and waited for them to return. Local history, in this sense, is not a minor supplement to the official record. It is often the record of what the official record was not designed to capture. The Channel Dash's place in German naval memory has a different texture. In the immediate post-war years, the operation was, like much else of the Third Reich's military history, a complicated subject in a country working through the practical and moral consequences of what the war had been. The men who had served on those ships were not, by and large, celebrated in the way that the immediate post-war propaganda had celebrated them. They were survivors, trying to reconstitute normal lives in a country that had been comprehensively destroyed. The official naval history of the German surface fleet, produced in the 1950s and 60s by former Kriegsmarine officers in the German Naval Historical Section, treated the Channel Dash with the particular combination of professional pride and institutional defensiveness that characterizes official histories produced by the defeated. The tactical execution was good, the histories acknowledged. The strategic context in which it occurred was, in retrospect, less propitious. That is a diplomatic way of saying that the ships went home to lose the war. The generations of naval officers who have studied the Channel Dash at staff colleges since the 1950s have extracted from it a set of lessons that are by now reasonably standardized. The German lesson, applied with some success in subsequent operations, was that bold, well-planned operations conducted with genuine security and executed with precise coordinations can achieve results that conventional threat assessments would predict to be impossible. The British lesson, applied at North Cape, at Normandy, and in the subsequent development of the Royal Navy's anti-ship doctrine, was that the gap between planning and execution is a structural problem that cannot be solved by hardware alone, and that the coordination of multiple arms against a single target requires command unity and joint training that cannot be improvised on the day. These lessons are not, in themselves, novel. They are variations on principles that military institutions have been learning and forgetting and relearning for as long as organized warfare has existed. What the Channel Dash provides is a particularly clean example of what those principles look like when they are applied well by one side and neglected by the other in the same operation at the same time. The question that the Channel Dash ultimately poses, and that has occupied military historians in proportion to its difficulty, is a question about the relationship between institutional excellence and individual courage. The Germans, on the 12th of February, had institutional excellence, planning, coordination, security, logistics, fighter management, damage control. The British, on the same day, had individual courage in abundance. Esmond flying his biplane into certain destruction, Saunders pressing through the E-boat screen, the crew of Worcester, who kept fighting after their ship had been stopped. What they did not have, what the day's events revealed with painful clarity, was the institutional framework that would have allowed that courage to be converted into effective military action. Courage by itself is not sufficient. It is the raw material. The institution is the manufacturing process that turns it into something with the power to change events. On the 12th of February, 1942, the German institution was better than the British one. Not dramatically so. Not in every respect, but in the specific combination of planning, security, and execution that the Channel Dash required. The gap was decisive. The final thing to say about the Channel Dash is something that the official histories and the staff college analyses and the carefully argued Academic papers tend to leave until their closing pages, if they include it at all. Esmond flew because he was ordered to. He also flew because he was who he was, because the family he came from, and the training he had received, and the professional culture he had inhabited had produced in him a particular kind of response to a particular kind of order. The distinction matters because it tells you something about what military institutions are actually building when they train their officers and develop their cultures. They are not primarily building systems. They are building people, people who will, when the system fails and the coordination breaks down, and the fighter cover is 10 Spitfires instead of 5 full squadrons, still do what the situation requires. Esmond's 6 Swordfish did not save the Channel. They did not hit the Scharnhorst. They did not change the military outcome of the 12th of February by a single measurable degree. But they flew anyway, and the institution they represented, battered, embarrassed, inadequately equipped on that specific day, went on to learn from its failures in a way that the institution on the other side, for all its tactical brilliance in February of 1942, ultimately did not. The Royal Navy that fought the Battle of the North Cape in December of 1943 was not the Royal Navy that failed at the Channel Dash. It was the same Navy, but it had used what happened to become better. That is what institutions do with their worst days, when they are working properly. They carry them forward. They do not waste them.